For centuries, they've remained hidden, swallowed by jungle, buried beneath desert sands, erased by the slow, indifferent hand of time. These are the places the world forgot, and the places that refuse to stay forgotten. What if the story of human civilization is far older and far stranger than we've been told? What if the ruins scattered across this planet hold answers to questions we haven't yet learned to ask? And what if the greatest mystery of all is not what was lost, but what was deliberately left behind? Join us as we spend the next 3 hours journeying to the most enigmatic, perplexing, and awe-inspiring archaeological sites on Earth. From the jungle temples of Cambodia to the stone spheres of Costa Rica, from the forgotten stepwells of India to the buried cities of Central Asia. Each destination carries a secret, and each secret challenges everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. This is not just a tour of ruins. This is a reckoning with the depths of human history. The forest here does not yield easily. Dense tropical canopy blots out the sky, filtering the morning light into thin golden threads that fall across crumbling stone like something sacred. The air is thick with humidity and the sound of unseen birds, and the ground beneath your feet is soft with centuries of fallen leaves. Moss has colonized everything. Stone and jungle have become one. Welcome to Koh Ker, a sprawling temple complex buried deep in the northern Cambodian highlands, roughly 120 kilometers from the more famous ruins of Angkor. Dating primarily to the 10th century CE, Koh Ker served briefly but magnificently as the capital of the Khmer Empire under King Jayavarman IV, who ruled from approximately 928 to 941 CE. In that short window of power, an extraordinary architectural ambition was unleashed upon this landscape. The site encompasses over 100 temples, shrines, and reservoirs, spread across more than 80 square kilometers of jungle terrain, a monument to imperial will and spiritual hunger that rivals almost any construction project of its era. What baffles archaeologists most about Koh Ker is not its scale, remarkable as that is, but rather the peculiar speed of its creation and abandonment. Jayavarman IV established his new capital here, breaking with the political and religious center at Angkor, and within a single decade erected dozens of monumental structures, including the iconic seven-tiered pyramid temple known as Prasat Tom, which rises over 36 meters above the jungle floor. What drove such feverish building? And why, when the capital returned to Angkor under his successor, was Koh Ker so thoroughly and swiftly abandoned? The Khmer civilization that built Koh Ker was one of Southeast Asia's most sophisticated, a hydraulic empire that mastered the management of water on a continental scale, using vast reservoirs and canal networks to support dense agricultural populations in the heart of a monsoon jungle. Hinduism and Buddhism mingled freely in Khmer religious life, and the kings were regarded as god-kings, divine intermediaries between the cosmic order and the earthly realm. Prasat Tom, with its towering stepped silhouette, was likely conceived as a cosmological mountain, a representation of Mount Meru, the sacred axis of the Hindu universe, planted in the Cambodian earth by royal decree. Mainstream scholarship holds that Koh Ker's rapid construction was a political statement. Jayavarman IV had seized the throne in what was likely a contested succession, and building a grand new capital, complete with temple mountains, elaborate water infrastructure, and hundreds of subsidiary shrines, was a declaration of legitimacy, power, and divine favor. Scholars point to the stylistic continuity between Koh Ker and earlier Khmer architecture as evidence that the builders drew on well-established traditions, simply applying them at extraordinary speed and scale. Others suggest that Koh Ker was more than a political monument, that it was a cosmic machine, a carefully engineered landscape designed to align with celestial bodies and channel divine energy. The orientation of the temples, the arrangement of shrines in concentric patterns around Prasat Tom, and the symbolic numerology embedded in the seven-tier design all point, for some researchers, to an astronomical and ritual logic far more complex than mere political propaganda. Perhaps the king was not just building a capital, perhaps he was building a portal. Could it be that Koh Ker reflects a depth of cosmological knowledge, a precise understanding of celestial mechanics, landscape geometry, and sacred architecture that remains incompletely understood today? Some researchers note that the spatial arrangement of structures at Koh Ker, when viewed from above, seems to encode patterns whose full meaning has yet to be decoded. Was there perhaps a master plan, a blueprint of sacred geometry, guiding every stone placement? Why did Jayavarman IV choose this specific location, so far from Angkor and its established infrastructure? How did thousands of workers quarry, transport, and erect hundreds of monumental stone structures within a single decade? What religious rites were performed within the inner sanctuaries of Prasat Tom, rites so sacred that no written record was kept? And when the court departed, what or who was left behind to tend the temples? Was this abandonment truly political, or was there something else, some rupture, some failure, some unspeakable event that drove the empire back south? Koh Ker stands as a testament to the astonishing capacity of human ambition and to the equal capacity of the natural world to reclaim what ambition builds. As you stand at the base of Prasat Tom, looking up at its moss-covered tiers rising into the canopy, you feel the full weight of those 12 centuries pressing down upon the stone. The jungle has been patient. The mystery has been patient too, and both, it seems, are content to wait indefinitely for answers that the ruins themselves refuse to provide. As we leave Koh Ker behind, its jungle-shrouded pyramids slowly fading into the green, we travel thousands of miles westward across the Indian Ocean to the sun-scorched coast of East Africa, where another forgotten city waits in silence. The contrast could not be sharper, from the damp, cathedral-dark forests of Cambodia to the dry, salt-kissed air of coastal Kenya. And yet both sites share the same haunting quality of a civilization that vanished before it could explain itself. Salt air drifts in from the Indian Ocean, just 2 kilometers to the east, carrying the faint smell of seaweed and open water. Baobab trees stand like ancient sentinels among the ruins, their swollen trunks older than the stones they shade. Bougainvillea has threaded itself through collapsed coral rag walls, blooming defiantly in magenta and orange. The light here is harsh and equatorial, bleaching the limestone white by midday, and the silence is broken only by the calls of colobus monkeys swinging through the canopy above. This is Gedi, or Gedi, a medieval Swahili city located in what is now the Kilifi County of coastal Kenya, just south of the town of Malindi. Founded sometime between the 11th and 12th centuries CE and abandoned in the 17th, Gedi was, at its height, a thriving urban center of several thousand people, a town of mosques, palaces, elaborate townhouses, and sophisticated plumbing infrastructure. It was part of the Great Swahili Coast Trading Network that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Arab world, India, and even distant China. Its existence suggests a level of urban sophistication in pre-colonial East Africa that was long underestimated, and in many ways still is. What baffles archaeologists most about Gedi is not what was found there, but what was not. Despite being a prosperous and apparently thriving city, Gedi appears in no contemporary Arab, Portuguese, or Chinese trading records. Extraordinary, given that Arab and Chinese merchants traded extensively along the East African coast during precisely the period of Gedi's occupation. The most perplexing discovery is the sheer invisibility of the place in historical memory. When the Portuguese arrived in the region in the early 16th century, they documented almost every settlement of note along the coast. Gedi, apparently, was not among them. Why was this city, with its grand Friday mosque, its sprawling palace complex, and its sophisticated water management systems, essentially absent from the historical record? And what catastrophe, or series of catastrophes, drove its population away so completely that even the memory of the place seemed to vanish? The Swahili civilization that built Gedi was the product of centuries of cultural fusion. African Bantu populations who had absorbed waves of Arab, Persian, and Indian influence through the maritime trade network of the Indian Ocean. Swahili society was mercantile and cosmopolitan, with Islam as a unifying religious force and trade goods, ivory, gold, slaves, iron, and mangrove timber as the engine of prosperity. At Gedi, archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain, Venetian glass beads, and Indian carnelian, all speaking to a city deeply embedded in global commerce. The townhouses were sophisticated, built of coral rag stone, with inner courtyards and carved decorative elements that echo both Arab and indigenous African aesthetic traditions. The prevailing scholarly theory for Gedi's abandonment is a combination of environmental and political pressures. Some archaeologists believe that prolonged drought in the 16th and 17th centuries made the shallow freshwater wells on which the city depended increasingly unreliable. Others point to raids by the Oromo people expanding southward from Ethiopia and to the destabilizing influence of Portuguese naval aggression along the Swahili coast. The city, they suggest, did not fall in a single catastrophic moment, but was gradually bled of its population over several generations until only the buildings remained. Others suggest a more mysterious dimension to Gedi's disappearance. Local oral traditions speak of a curse laid upon the city by a powerful ruler, a supernatural interdiction that drove the inhabitants out and made the place spiritually dangerous. The ruins are considered deeply haunted by the surrounding communities, and the site has long been associated with ancestral spirits and with what the Giriama people call the power of the Ancient Ones. Could Gedi have been deliberately abandoned as an act of ritual closure? A city not conquered or starved out, but consciously vacated, its people choosing to leave a place that had, for spiritual or cosmological reasons, become untenable. Some even wonder if Gedi's extraordinary invisibility in the historical record was not accidental but intentional, a deliberate erasure, perhaps, by a community that wished to protect its location, its wealth, or its spiritual practices from the growing intrusions of Portuguese colonial power. Could there be records of Gedi that have not yet been found, buried in archives in Lisbon, Istanbul, or Beijing? Why do Arab traders, so meticulous in their documentation of East African ports, never mention a city of this scale and apparent prosperity? How did the builders of Gedi acquire the technical knowledge to construct a sophisticated water system with wells and drainage channels that served a population of thousands in a region with no surface rivers? What happened to the objects that would have furnished the palace and the mosque? The textiles, the wooden furniture, the ritual objects that vanished as completely as the people. And why do the people who live near Gedi today still regard the ruins with a mixture of reverence and fear? Gedi stands as a testament to the Swahili civilization's extraordinary reach and to the extraordinary ease with which entire chapters of African history have been overlooked, undervalued, and lost. The story of Gedi is not a story about what was destroyed. It is a story about what was forgotten and what it means for a city, a culture, and a people to be rendered invisible by the weight of historical neglect. The ruins are still here, the mystery unresolved, and the colobus monkeys, indifferent to all of it, go on swinging through the baobab trees. From the humid, ghost-haunted ruins of the Kenyan coast, our journey now carries us northward and westward across thousands of miles of ocean and continent, to the cold, wind-lashed plains of Scandinavia. The contrast is absolute, from tropical coral rag and baobab to granite and iron-grey sky. But the questions we carry with us remain the same. The wind comes in low off the Jutland Heath, carrying the smell of heather and cold North Sea air. The sky here is the color of iron in autumn, and the grass in the churchyard bends and straightens with each gust. Two massive boulders stand in the open, flanking the entrance to a small Danish church, incongruous in their scale, their surfaces carved with figures and text that feel ancient and urgent, as though they were left here with a specific message that the centuries have made harder, not easier, to hear. These are the Jelling Stones, two runic monuments located in the town of Jelling in central Jutland, Denmark, erected in the 10th century CE and recognized today as some of the most important objects in all of Scandinavian history. The smaller stone was raised by King Gorm the Old in memory of his wife Thyra, the first known royal inscription in Denmark. The larger stone was raised by their son, Harald Bluetooth, around 965 CE, and bears one of the most consequential proclamations in Northern European history, a declaration that Harald had won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The Jelling Stones are not merely monuments. They are the birth certificate of a nation and the death certificate of a religion. What makes the Jelling complex so perplexing is not the stones themselves, remarkable as they are, but the broader archaeological context in which they sit, a context that continues to yield unsettling surprises. Beneath the church and the surrounding mounds, archaeologists have found evidence of one of the largest Viking Age burial complexes in the world, a vast ship-shaped stone setting over 360 meters long, oriented north to south, with the two great mounds at its center. The most perplexing discovery came when excavations beneath the church revealed a royal burial chamber containing the skeletal remains of a high-status individual, remains that were later removed, placed in an ornate reliquary, and deposited in the church above. Whose bones were these? Why were pagan burial remains enshrined within a Christian church? And what does the coexistence of these two religious worlds at the same site tell us about the actual texture of Denmark's conversion to Christianity? The Viking Age society that created the Jelling monuments was one of the most dynamic and far-reaching civilizations of the medieval world. Norse culture, rooted in a rich tradition of oral poetry, shipbuilding, and martial achievement, had expanded from Scandinavia to touch England, France, Iceland, Greenland, and the eastern rivers of Russia. The Norse religious world was populated by a complex pantheon Odin, Thor, Freya, and the dead were honored with elaborate grave goods and monumental burial structures. Jelling was the dynastic heartland of the Danish kings, and its monuments mark a pivotal transition from a pagan world of mounds and runestones to a Christian world of churches and baptism. The prevailing scholarly view of the Jelling Stones frames them as a sophisticated piece of royal propaganda. Harold Bluetooth, scholars argue, embraced Christianity not primarily out of spiritual conviction, but for geopolitical reasons. Converting gave him a common religious language with the powerful Holy Roman Empire to the south and reduced the pressure of Christian missionary activity that could be used to destabilize his kingdom. The Jelling Stone, with its bold proclamation of Christian identity and its image of Christ, the oldest known depiction of Christ in Scandinavia, was, in this reading, a political instrument as much as a religious one. Others suggest that the Jelling complex represents something far more nuanced, a genuine spiritual negotiation, a moment in which a society attempted to hold two cosmologies simultaneously. The decision to exhume a pagan burial and reinter it within a Christian church was not perhaps an act of erasure, but of translation, an attempt to bring the ancestral dead into the new religious order, to baptize the past along with the present. Perhaps Harold believed or hoped that the Norse gods and the Christian God could coexist, that the transition from one world to the other need not require the total destruction of what came before. Could it be that the Jelling Stones encode a deeper cosmological statement, a map of power, ancestry, and cosmic legitimacy that operated simultaneously in the idioms of two religions? Some researchers note that the placement of the stones, the mounds, and the ship setting seems deliberately calibrated to orient the entire complex toward specific solar events. Was there perhaps a sophisticated understanding of landscape and celestial alignment embedded in the design that predates the rune stones themselves? Why were the bones in the burial chamber relocated rather than simply left in place? Who decided to remove them, and under what authority? Why does the image of Christ on the large Jelling stone bear stylistic similarities to pre-Christian Norse iconography? Was this a deliberate syncretism, a careful blending of traditions designed to ease the psychological shock of conversion? And what happened to the religious practices and sacred knowledge of the Norse priests, the Gothar, when Christianity came to Jelling? The Jelling Stones stand as a testament to the profound, often violent, always complicated process by which human cultures transform themselves. They are a record of a moment when an entire civilization looked at its gods, its ancestors, and its place in the cosmos, and chose, or was compelled, to see all three differently. The story of Jelling is not over. The bones in the reliquary still hold their silence, and the runes on the stones, worn now by 1,000 years of Nordic weather, continue to pose their quiet, unanswerable questions. We leave the cold winds of Jutland behind and journey southeast, crossing the breadth of the Eurasian continent and the vast Indian Ocean to arrive on the tropical island of Sri Lanka, where a city of almost incomprehensible antiquity and scale waits in the shadow of ancient trees. Sacred fig trees cast pools of dense shade across the pale stone, their roots clutching ancient brickwork with a tenderness that looks, from a distance, like an embrace. White dagobas, dome-shaped reliquary stupas, rise above the canopy in perfect hemispheres, their plastered surfaces gleaming under the tropical sun. The air smells of frangipani and incense. Pilgrims in white move silently between the ruins and the living temples, their bare feet on ground that has been considered holy for more than 2,000 years. Welcome to Anuradhapura, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, and the sacred heart of Sri Lankan Buddhist civilization. Located in the north-central province of Sri Lanka, Anuradhapura served as the island's capital for over 13 centuries, from roughly the 4th century BCE to the 10th century CE. At its height, it was one of the great cities of the ancient world, a metropolis of several 100,000 people with sophisticated plumbing systems, towering monuments, and a religious infrastructure that made it a destination for Buddhist pilgrims from across Asia. The sacred Bo tree, growing at the heart of the city, planted according to tradition from a cutting of the tree under which the Buddha attained enlightenment, is considered the oldest historically documented tree in the world, now more than 2,300 years old. What baffles archaeologists about Anuradhapura is the extraordinary sophistication of its hydraulic engineering, a water management system so advanced, so precise, and so enduring that it continued to function, in part, for over a millennium. The most perplexing discovery involves the massive reservoirs known as tanks, some stretching for kilometers, that were built to store monsoon water for use in the long dry season. Engineers studying these structures have found that the ancient builders possessed a precise understanding of hydraulic pressure, sluice design, and water flow that by any reasonable assessment should not have existed at the time of construction. How did a civilization of the 3rd century BCE design overflow mechanisms that modern hydraulic engineers describe as elegant solutions to problems they themselves struggle with today? And where did this knowledge come from? The civilization that built Anuradhapura was Sinhalese Buddhist, a fusion of indigenous Sri Lankan culture with the Theravada Buddhist tradition that arrived from the Indian subcontinent in the 3rd century BCE, according to tradition through the mission of Mahinda, son of the Indian Emperor Ashoka. The city became not just a political capital, but a spiritual one, the home of the sacred tooth relic of the Buddha, the keeper of the Bo tree, and the center of a monastic community that at times housed tens of thousands of monks. The Great Dagobas, the Ruwanwelisaya, the Jetavanaramaya, the Abhayagiri were among the tallest structures on Earth when they were built, and their construction required a mastery of mass and material that rivals anything the ancient world produced. The prevailing scholarly explanation for Anuradhapura's hydraulic genius emphasizes the role of accumulated empirical knowledge. Generations of farmers and engineers learning through trial and error, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for managing the seasonal rhythms of water on a tropical island. The massive tanks, in this view, were not the product of a single brilliant insight, but of centuries of incremental improvement, each generation building on the successes and failures of the last. This is a compelling model, and yet it does not fully account for the precision of some of the earliest constructions, which show an understanding of fluid dynamics that seems to precede the experiential base from which it supposedly derived. Others suggest that the hydraulic achievements of Anuradhapura were inseparable from the Buddhist spiritual project, that the creation of abundance through water management was understood as a form of merit-making, a physical expression of the Buddhist virtue of generosity. The king who built a tank was not merely an engineer, he was a bodhisattva in training, accumulating the karma of a benefactor. In this framework, the extraordinary investment of labor and knowledge in water infrastructure was motivated not by economic calculation, but by a cosmological imperative, the conviction that the righteous ordering of the physical world was a reflection of and contribution to the righteous ordering of the spiritual one. Could it be that Anuradhapura's builders possessed theoretical knowledge about hydraulics, perhaps derived from contact with other ancient civilizations, perhaps developed independently, that went far beyond what has been preserved in any surviving text? Some researchers have noted curious parallels between certain structural features of the ancient tanks and hydraulic principles described in texts that would not be formally codified for another 1,000 years. Was there perhaps a tradition of technical knowledge transmitted through practice rather than writing that has been entirely lost? How did ancient Sri Lankan engineers calculate the precise gradient needed for water to flow from reservoir to field without either stagnating or eroding the channel? Why do some of the early tanks show a level of geometric precision in their embankments, their sluice placements, their catchment designs that suggests sophisticated surveying tools or methods? What became of the communities of engineers who held this knowledge? Did they write it down, pass it orally, or was it simply lost with the disruptions of invasion and abandonment? And why, when the city fell to the Chola Empire in the 10th century, did the hydraulic system not collapse immediately but continue to function for centuries more? Anuradhapura stands as a testament to the breathtaking ambitions of human civilization, at its most spiritually and technically integrated. The bow tree still grows, still tended, still encircled by golden railings, and the soft prayers of those who believe it has stood since the dawn of enlightenment itself. The water, in some channels, still flows, and the questions that the engineers of Anuradhapura posed with their tanks and sluices, questions about how a society sustains itself across centuries, how it stores abundance and shares it equitably, remain, in every sense, unanswered. From the sacred stillness of Sri Lanka, our journey carries us northward across the Indian subcontinent to the foothills of the Punjab, to a place where the ancient world's great trade routes converged, and where the evidence of a dozen civilizations lies layered in the earth like the pages of a book no one has yet fully learned to read. The Margala Hills rise in the distance, hazy and blue in the morning light. The air here, at the edge of the Punjab plains, carries the dust of centuries, the fine, pale silt of an ancient floodplain that has buried and preserved and buried again the accumulated evidence of more than 3,000 years of continuous habitation. Dry grasses bend in the wind where streets once ran. Broken columns catch the afternoon light. Somewhere beneath your feet, 17 distinct archaeological layers press down on one another like the compressed pages of a vast, unread archive. Taxila, known in Sanskrit as Takshashila, lies in what is now the Rawalpindi district of Punjab, Pakistan, approximately 35 kilometers northwest of the modern capital Islamabad. It was for much of the first millennium BCE and the 1st century CE one of the most important cities in the ancient world. A crossroads where the Persian Empire, the Mauritian Empire, the Hellenistic world of Alexander the Great, and the later Kushan and Parthian kingdoms all intersected, Taxila was a place where East and West met. Not in war, though war came here too, but in philosophy, medicine, art, and trade. Its ancient university is considered one of the earliest in human history, attracting students from as far as Babylon, Greece, and China to study in disciplines ranging from grammar and medicine to law and military science. What baffles archaeologists about Taxila is the sheer depth and complexity of its layering. 17 distinct periods of occupation compressed into a site that spans several square kilometers, each stratum yielding artifacts and structures that speak to a different chapter of the city's extraordinary biography. The most perplexing discovery involves the relationship between the three main ruined cities that constitute the Taxila complex: Pir Mound, Sirkap, and Sirsuk, each of which represents a complete urban relocation, a wholesale decision to abandon one city plan and begin another. Why did the inhabitants of Taxila, on at least two distinct occasions, choose to entirely relocate their city rather than simply expand and modify the existing settlement? What logic, political, cosmological, or practical, drove these complete urban restarts? And what knowledge was lost or gained with each relocation? Taxila's civilizational biography is a story of extraordinary cosmopolitanism. The city was already a center of learning when it entered the historical record in the 6th century BCE, a time when it formed part of the Achaemenid Persian satrapy of Gandhara. It later welcomed Alexander the Great in 326 BCE, becoming, for a brief period, a frontier outpost of the Hellenistic world. Under the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, it became a center of Buddhist proselytism. And in the Gandharan period, roughly the 1st to 5th centuries CE, it produced some of the most remarkable religious art in human history. The Gandharan Buddha sculptures, a syncretic fusion of Greek classicism and South Asian iconography that represents one of the most creative cultural collisions in the ancient world. The prevailing scholarly view of Taxila's multiple urban relocations emphasizes military strategy and royal preference. Sirkap, built on a grid plan that reflects Hellenistic urban design principles, was almost certainly laid out after the Greek Bactrian conquest of the region in the 2nd century BCE, a planned city imposed by a new political order. Sirsuk, the 3rd city, is less well understood, but appears to have been built by the Kushan Empire in the early centuries CE. In this reading, each urban relocation marks a political transition, a new dynasty building its own city as a statement of authority and fresh beginning. Others suggest that Taxila's serial self-reinvention reflects something more than political pragmatism, that the repeated decisions to start fresh, to lay out entirely new urban grids on new ground, reflect a cosmological imperative rooted in ideas about purity, auspiciousness, and the relationship between a city's physical form and its spiritual vitality. In some ancient South Asian traditions, the physical layout of a city, its orientation, its proportions, its relationship to rivers and hills, was a microcosmic representation of the ordered cosmos. A city that had become spiritually compromised by defeat or by pollution required not renovation, but total renewal. Some researchers even wonder if the proximity of Taxila to some of the world's great trade routes, the Uttarapatha, the northern highway of the ancient world, gave its scholars access to technical and philosophical knowledge from Mesopotamia, Persia, Greece, and China that has never been fully accounted for in the historical record. Could the university at Taxila have been not merely a school, but a repository, a place where knowledge from across the ancient world was gathered, synthesized, and preserved in forms that have not survived? What became of the vast library of knowledge that the university at Taxila must have accumulated over centuries of scholarly activity? Why is so little of Taxila's own written production preserved, given the city's evident intellectual vitality? How did the Gandharan sculptors reconcile the Greek Apollo with the Indian Siddhartha? And what does this artistic synthesis tell us about the depth of cultural exchange that was occurring? And when Taxila was sacked and burned by the White Huns in the 5th century CE. What knowledge died with the city that has never been recovered? Taxila stands as a testament to the astonishing permeability of ancient cultures, their willingness to absorb, recombine, and reinvent across geographic and civilizational boundaries that modern imagination tends to draw too firmly. The ruins speak of a world that was, in many respects, more cosmopolitan than anything that followed for nearly 1,000 years. The questions they raise about the movement and mutation of knowledge across the ancient world are questions that scholarship has barely begun to answer. We leave the layered dust of Taxila and travel east and south, across the Himalayas and the Bay of Bengal, to a landscape of immense spiritual ambition, a plain in central Myanmar where more than 10,000 temple spires once rose against the sky, and where even today thousands remain, their red brick silhouettes burning in the Irrawaddy sunset. The sun sets over the Irrawaddy River, and the plain of Bagan turns to fire. Thousands of brick temples, stupas, and monasteries catch the last light, their red and ochre surfaces glowing as though illuminated from within. The silhouettes multiply toward the horizon, a forest of spires that stretches in every direction as far as the eye can reach. Hot air balloons drift silently among them in the dawn. Dust devils move across the dry earth between the monuments. The scale of this place is so far beyond ordinary comprehension that the mind keeps refusing to fully process it. Bagan, located on the east bank of the Irrawaddy in the Mandalay region of Myanmar, was the capital of the pagan empire, which unified much of what is now Myanmar between the 9th and 13th centuries CE. At its peak, the city and its immediate surrounds contained more than 10,000 religious structures, temples, pagodas, ordination halls, and libraries, constructed over a period of approximately 200 years, primarily between the 11th and 13th centuries. Today, roughly 3,000 of these structures survive in varying states of preservation, making Bagan one of the densest concentrations of Buddhist monuments on Earth. The sheer ambition of what was built here, in terms of both scale and artistry, places Bagan in a category shared by only a handful of sites in human history. What baffles archaeologists and architectural historians about Bagan is the question of resource sustainability. The construction of thousands of brick temples over 2 centuries would have required an extraordinary and sustained mobilization of labor, materials, and expertise. A mobilization that by any reasonable calculation must have imposed enormous strains on the agricultural and demographic foundations of the empire. The most perplexing aspect of this is the apparent paradox at the heart of the pagan economy. The more the kings built, the more they donated the revenues of the surrounding agricultural land to the Buddhist monasteries that maintained the temples, thereby steadily reducing the tax base that funded further construction. How did the pagan empire sustain this apparently self-undermining cycle of monument building and revenue donation for over 2 centuries? And was it ultimately this paradox, rather than the Mongol invasions of the late 13th century, that brought the empire down? The civilization that built Bagan was rooted in Theravada Buddhism, the school of Buddhist thought that emphasizes individual liberation through adherence to the original teachings of the historical Buddha. For the kings of Bagan, the construction of religious monuments was not merely an act of piety. It was a statement of cosmological power, a demonstration that the king stood at the center of a righteous universe, radiating merit and blessing outward through the physical structures he commissioned. the great temple complexes, the Ananda, the Damayangi, the Sulamani, were not just places of worship, but cosmic statements. Their proportions and decorative programs, encoding sophisticated Buddhist philosophy in brick and plaster and lacquered wood. The prevailing scholarly explanation for Bagan's monument-building frenzy emphasizes the role of competitive piety among the pagan ruling class. Kings, queens, and noble families competed with one another to demonstrate their spiritual merit, and therefore their political legitimacy, through the scale and quality of the monuments they built. This competition, scholars argue, drove a positive feedback loop. Each monument required more labor, more skill, and more resources than the last, pushing the boundaries of Burmese architectural achievement steadily upward. The system was, in a sense, its own engine. Others suggest that the temples of Bagan encode a vision of the cosmos that goes beyond mere royal propaganda, that the layout of the entire city was conceived as a three-dimensional mandala, a sacred map of the Buddhist universe in which the king's palace at the center corresponded to Mount Meru, the axis of the cosmos, and the surrounding temples represented the concentric realms of existence radiating outward from that center. In this reading, Bagan was not merely a city, but a physical dharma, an entire landscape shaped into a teaching about the nature of reality. Could it be that the pagan architects possessed, in addition to their extraordinary aesthetic sensibility, a mathematical and engineering knowledge that allowed them to design structures of such durability and precision that they have survived 8 centuries of earthquakes, monsoons, and neglect? Some structural engineers have noted that the bricklaying and mortar techniques used in the best-preserved Bagan temples demonstrate an understanding of load distribution and stress management that seems to exceed what contemporary records suggest should have been available. How did the royal architects of Bagan acquire the technical knowledge to design and build temples of such structural sophistication, some rising over 60 meters, in a region with no tradition of monumental stone construction before the empire? What happened to the administrative and engineering expertise of Bagan when the Mongol invasions disrupted the empire? Was it preserved, scattered, or simply lost? Why do so many of the temple interiors contain frescoes whose iconographic programs have never been fully decoded? And what lies beneath the thousands of unexcavated mounds that still dot the Bagan plain? Bagan stands as a testament to the extraordinary creative energy that religious conviction, royal ambition, and artistic genius can produce when they converge in a single landscape at a single moment in history. The plain of Bagan is, in the most literal sense, a civilization turned into architecture, a people's entire spiritual world, made physical, made permanent, made visible from the air. And yet even here, even surrounded by thousands of structures that have survived for 8 centuries, the most fundamental questions remain unanswered. The stones know something. They are not yet ready to tell us what it is. From the vast, sacred plain of Myanmar, our journey now carries us across the Pacific, to a smaller, more intimate mystery, but one that is, in its own way, no less baffling. In the lowland rainforests of Costa Rica, smooth spheres of stone lie scattered across the earth, placed there by hands whose intentions we cannot begin to fully understand. The rainforest floor here is carpeted in a deep, unbroken green. Ferns and mosses, and the slow, patient spread of tropical undergrowth that reclaims everything, given time. Light filters through the canopy in shifting columns, and the air is warm and saturated with moisture. And there, among the roots and the fallen leaves, perfectly round stones, rest on the earth as if they had always been there, as if they had grown there, like fruit from some impossible geological tree. The stone spheres of Costa Rica, known locally as Las Bolas, are one of the most enigmatic collections of prehistoric objects in the Western Hemisphere. Found primarily in the Diquís Delta region of southern Costa Rica and on the Isla del Caño, these stone spheres range in size from a few centimeters to over 2 meters in diameter, with the largest specimens weighing more than 15 metric tons. They were created by the pre-Columbian peoples of the Diquís culture, most likely between 800 and 1500 CE, though some researchers suggest even earlier origins. There are several hundred known spheres, and they are distributed across a landscape that stretches from the Pacific coastal plain to the foothills of the Cordillera. In 2014, they were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognition of their uniqueness and of the deep mystery they embody. What baffles archaeologists most about the Costa Rican stone spheres is the combination of their near-perfect roundness and the apparent simplicity of the tools available to their makers. The most perplexing discovery is the degree of precision. The largest and most precisely formed spheres deviate from perfect roundness by less than half a centimeter, an accuracy that, when achieved without metal tools, without lathes, and without any measuring technology more sophisticated than cord and eye, represents either an extraordinary refinement of manual technique or evidence of a manufacturing process that has not been identified. How did the Diquís culture grind enormous boulders of gabbro and granodiorite, rocks of exceptional hardness, into near-perfect spheres with Stone Age tools? And why, of all possible shapes, did they choose the sphere? The people who created these objects were the Diquís, a complex chiefdom society in what is now southwestern Costa Rica that at its height organized the labor of thousands of people for large-scale projects. The Diquís were skilled goldsmiths, creating sophisticated jade and gold ornaments that bespeak a highly developed aesthetic tradition. They were also clearly capable of monumental undertakings, moving spheres weighing up to 15 tons from quarry sites to their final placements, sometimes across rivers and through dense jungle, required the sustained cooperative effort of large social groups. The spheres have been found in burial mounds, in alignment patterns in front of what appear to have been chiefly residences, and, thanks to the disruptions of the banana plantation era, in positions too displaced from their original contexts to yield their full meaning. The prevailing scholarly view of the stone spheres proposes that they were status symbols, objects of power and prestige that marked the wealth and authority of chiefly lineages. Their placement near high-status residences and burial mounds supports this interpretation. Some archaeologists further suggest that the spheres functioned as territorial markers or as focal points for communal ritual activity, objects around which the social and symbolic life of a community was organized. The investment required to create and transport them made them naturally rare and therefore naturally powerful as symbols of authority. Others suggest that the spheres were not primarily status symbols, but cosmological objects, physical representations of celestial bodies, perhaps the sun or the full moon, placed deliberately in arrangements that encoded astronomical knowledge. A number of spheres have been found in alignments that some researchers argue correspond to solstice or equinox directions. Perhaps the spheres were a way of anchoring cosmic time to the Earth, of making the movements of the sky legible in stone arrangements that could be read across generations. Some even wonder whether the near-perfect roundness of the largest spheres required a level of geometric knowledge, an understanding of the mathematical properties of the sphere that seems inconsistent with what we know about Dikis material culture. Could it be that the makers of these objects possessed a mathematical tradition, perhaps transmitted orally or through practice, that has left no other trace in the archaeological record? Why were some spheres placed in elaborate geometric arrangements, triangles, rows, and curves, while others appear to have been placed alone? How did the Dikis move multi-ton stone objects across a landscape that includes rivers, ravines, and dense jungle, without the wheel, without large domesticated animals, and without metal tools? What happened to the culture that made them? Why did they disappear so completely in the decades following Spanish contact that their descendants do not even preserve a clear oral tradition about the sphere's origin? And what meaning would be restored to us if the original arrangements of the spheres could be reconstructed in full? The stone spheres of Costa Rica stand as a testament to the human capacity for precision, for the patient, obsessive application of intelligence and effort toward an aesthetic or spiritual ideal whose full contours remain hidden from us. They are objects of profound quietness. They do not shout their meaning. They do not demand interpretation. They simply sit, round and patient, in the forest and the museum forecourt and the rancher's field, waiting for a question that is smart enough to unlock them. We leave the rainforest spheres of Costa Rica and travel eastward, across the Atlantic and deep into the Indian subcontinent, to a structure so extraordinary in its geometric ambition and engineering precision that it feels, even today, like something from a civilization more technically sophisticated than the one we believe built it. The Rajasthani sun is merciless at noon, a white, annihilating light that bleaches the sandstone to the color of old bone and raises mirages at the edges of the dusty plain. And then the earth opens. You step to the edge and look down, and the geometry of the world suddenly inverts. The sunlight becomes a ceiling. The stone becomes a series of descending planes, and the air, cooled by proximity to water far below, rises to meet your face like a secret. You are standing at the top of one of the most astonishing architectural spaces ever created. This is Chand Baori, a stepwell located in the village of Abhaneri in the Dausa district of Rajasthan, India, built between the 8th and 9th centuries CE, during the reign of King Chanda of the Nikumba dynasty, from whom the structure takes its name. At approximately 30 meters deep and roughly 60 meters square, it is one of the largest and deepest stepwells in India, a country that has produced hundreds of such structures, and it is widely regarded as the most geometrically perfect of them all. 1,400 steps, arranged in precise V-shaped patterns on 3 sides, descend from ground level to the water below through 30 levels of terraced landings. As you stand at the edge, the pattern of steps and shadows creates an optical effect of almost hypnotic regularity, a visual rhythm so precise, so relentless, that the eye cannot find a resting place, and the mind begins to tilt. What baffles engineers and architectural historians about Chand Baori is the precision of its geometry. The most perplexing aspect of the structure is not its depth or its scale, impressive as those are, but the extraordinary accuracy with which 3,500 narrow steps are arranged across 1,400 individual stair sections in a pattern that maintains perfect geometric consistency from the top of the well to the water level 30 meters below. The steps are of uniform dimensions throughout. The landings are precisely level, and the overall pattern is so mathematically regular that any deviation from the underlying geometric plan would have been immediately apparent. How did 9th century builders, working without modern surveying equipment, achieve and maintain this level of precision across the full vertical and horizontal extent of the structure? And why invest such extraordinary effort in achieving it? The civilization that built Chand Baori was Rajput Hindu, a warrior aristocratic culture in which the construction of temples, tanks, and wells was both a practical act of resource management and a deeply sacred one. Rajasthan, lying in the arid zone of northwestern India, where rainfall is scarce and unpredictable, made water a matter of existential importance. Stepwells, known as Baori or Vav, were not merely functional water access structures. They were places of social gathering, religious activity, and architectural expression. The finest stepwells, like Chand Baori, were embellished with shrines, sculpture, and decorative carving, making them simultaneously civic infrastructure and sacred space. The descent into the stepwell was understood as a literal and metaphorical journey toward the sacred, water being associated in Hindu cosmology with creation, purity, and the generative principle of the universe. The prevailing scholarly view of Chand Baori's geometric precision emphasizes the sophistication of Rajput architectural tradition, a tradition that, by the 8th century, had developed highly refined surveying and planning methods passed down through guilds of specialized craftsmen known as sthapatis. These master builders possessed detailed knowledge of proportion, geometry, and structural engineering, encoded in Sanskrit architectural treatises known as the Vastu Shastra and the Manasara. The precision of Chand Baori in this view is the product of a mature technical tradition applied with exceptional skill to an exceptionally ambitious project. Others suggest that the geometric perfection of Chand Baori served a spiritual purpose beyond the merely aesthetic, that the relentless, vertiginous repetition of its step pattern was designed to produce a specific psychological effect in the descending visitor, a dissolution of the ordinary sense of self, a loss of grounding in the familiar three-dimensional world that would prepare the spirit for encounter with the sacred at the water's edge. In Hindu sacred architecture, the approach to the divine is often structured as a journey through increasingly disorienting, increasingly sacred space. Chand Baori may have been designed to accomplish this journey in 3 dimensions. Some researchers even wonder whether the mathematical properties of Chand Baori's geometry, the relationship between the number of steps, the angle of descent, and the overall proportions of the structure, encode a deliberate numerical symbolism that has not yet been fully decoded. The number of steps, the number of levels, the precise relationship between depth and width. Could these be a numerical text, a message encoded in stone? What knowledge did the Sthapati who designed Chand Baori bring to this project? And where did that knowledge come from? How was the construction of 3,500 individually placed steps managed and coordinated across a 30-meter vertical excavation in 9th century Rajasthan? Why has no comparable structure been found anywhere in the world outside the Indian subcontinent? Is the stepwell form a uniquely Indian solution to a universal problem? Or does it reflect a specific cosmological tradition? And if the structure was designed to produce a particular effect in the descending visitor, what effect was intended at the very bottom, at the water itself? Chand Baori stands as a testament to the capacity of architecture to be simultaneously practical and transcendent, to solve the problem of water access and the problem of spiritual encounter in the same gesture. The geometry is not decorative. The geometry is the meaning. And as you stand at the bottom, looking back up through 30 levels of symmetrical stone toward the blazing Rajasthani sky, you understand, in your body if not in your mind, that the people who built this place knew something about space, scale, and the human spirit that the centuries have not yet fully translated. From the geometric depths of Rajasthan, our journey carries us westward, across the Arabian Sea to the Persian Gulf, to an island nation whose ancient mound cities hold the memories of one of the earliest trading civilizations in human history. The Gulf wind carries salt and the distant smell of petroleum, two kinds of wealth separated by 40 centuries, both drawn from the same stretch of shallow sea. The tell rises gently from the flat coastal plain, a mound of compressed human history that lifts the ruins of a Portuguese fort above the sun-baked mud and the older, deeper layers of a civilization that managed the trade between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley for nearly 2,000 years. The water shimmers on the horizon. The horizon here feels ancient. Qal'at al-Bahrain, the Fort of Bahrain, is an archaeological site on the northern coast of the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2005. The site consists of a tell or occupation mound, approximately 17 hectares in area and rising 8 to 10 meters above the surrounding plain, which contains the layered remains of continuous human settlement from approximately 2300 BCE to the 16th century CE. At its heart lies the ancient city of Dilmun, a place that appears repeatedly in Sumerian texts as a land of sacred significance, a trading hub of extraordinary importance, and in some of the oldest written mythology in the world, a paradise at the edge of the world where the dead go and the gods refresh themselves. What baffles archaeologists about Qal'at al-Bahrain is the extraordinary persistence of occupation at this single location, layer upon layer of habitation representing dozens of different cultural phases, from the Dilmun Bronze Age through the Kassites, the Assyrians, the Achaemenid Persians, the Greeks, the Parthians, and finally the Portuguese, all choosing the same spot across 40 centuries to build their most significant structure. The most perplexing discovery is the identification of the site with ancient Dilmun, a name that appears in Sumerian texts as a kind of cosmic origin point, a place of primordial purity that predates death, disease, and suffering. How did a real, functioning trading port come to occupy such an exalted position in the mythology of the ancient Near East? And what does it mean that the physical center of paradise, as the Sumerians conceived it, was also one of the busiest commercial hubs in the ancient world? The Dilmun civilization that first flourished at Qal'at al-Bahrain was a Bronze Age trading culture that mediated the exchange of goods between Mesopotamia to the northwest and the Indus Valley civilization to the east. Copper from Oman, carnelian and cotton from India, textiles and grain from Sumer. Dilmun appears in some of the earliest Sumerian administrative texts as a source of luxury goods and as a partner in long-distance trade. The city at Qal'at al-Bahrain was its capital, a walled urban center with a palace complex, a temple, and the dense, layered residential quarters of a mercantile population. The freshwater springs that well up through the seabed around Bahrain, a hydrological anomaly that made the island green and habitable in an otherwise arid region, may have contributed to its mythological status as a place of miraculous provision. The prevailing scholarly view of Dilmun's sacred status argues that the freshwater springs and the island's remarkable fertility in an otherwise desert region provided the experiential basis for its mythological reputation. In a world where fresh water was the most precious of resources, an island where sweet water literally bubbled up through the seabed was genuinely extraordinary. A place where the boundary between the earthly and the divine seemed unusually thin. The Sumerian myths that describe Dilmun as a paradise may reflect a genuine geographic reality, overlaid and amplified by the usual mechanisms of mythological elaboration. Others suggest that Dilmun's mythological centrality reflects something more deliberately constructed, that the Dilmunite rulers cultivated their island's sacred reputation as a deliberate commercial strategy, presenting themselves as the keepers of a holy place in order to guarantee the neutrality and safety of a trading port that served customers from across the ancient world. A port that was also a paradise was a port that no one wanted to attack. The sacred and the commercial in this reading were not in tension but in alliance. Could it be that the identification of Qal'at al-Bahrain with the Sumerian paradise of Dilmun reflects a real memory of a much earlier civilization, one that predated even the Dilmun Bronze Age, whose traces lie in the deepest and as yet unexcavated layers of the Tell? Bahrain is known to have been inhabited since at least the 5th millennium BCE, and the full archaeological sequence of the site has not been completely explored. Why did successive civilizations, Kassite, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Parthian, continue to build their most significant structures on this same mound, rather than founding new cities elsewhere on the island? What was the nature of the Dilmunite religious practice? The texts speak of temples and of the god Enki's special affection for the place, but what did worship look like on this island at the edge of the ancient world? How did the trade network that Dilmun managed, spanning from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, function without the bureaucratic and transportation infrastructure that such a network seems to require? And is there more to find in the deepest layers of the Tell? Qal'at al-Bahrain stands as a testament to the extraordinary longevity of sacred places, the way in which a location, once identified as holy or significant, seems to attract human attention and investment across millennia and across the boundaries of entirely different civilizations. The layers of the Tell are a record not just of who lived here, but of why this particular spot, on this particular island, in this particular gulf, seemed to every civilization that encountered it to be worth building on. The answer to that question may lie in the freshwater springs, or it may lie somewhere deeper. Leaving the ancient shores of Bahrain, we travel northwest, along the old trade routes to the Jordanian desert, where the black basalt ruins of a late antique city rise from the volcanic plain, a community that flourished without a river, without an empire, and apparently without the need for either. The Harat Ash-Sham volcanic basalt field stretches flat and black in every direction, a lunar landscape of dark rock that absorbs heat in the day and radiates it back at night, turning the desert into a kind of geological furnace. There are no trees here, no rivers, no surface water of any kind in the ordinary sense. The sky is immense, and in the middle of this geological severity, the ruins of an entire city rise from the black rock in the same black rock, as if the buildings had been extruded directly from the earth, as if the desert had built them itself. El-Jimal is an ancient site located in northeastern Jordan, in the volcanic basalt region known as the Hauran, approximately 10 kilometers from the Syrian border. The visible ruins date primarily to the late antique and early Islamic periods, roughly the 3rd through 8th centuries CE, though the site has evidence of earlier Nabatean occupation. At its height, el-Jimal was a prosperous market town of several thousand inhabitants, a community that managed the trade routes between the Syrian interior and the Arabian Peninsula. What makes el-Jimal extraordinary is not its political importance. It was never a capital or a major imperial center, but its social complexity, its architectural sophistication, and above all, its remarkable hydrological ingenuity. Here, in one of the driest inhabited regions on Earth, a community built and sustained a city for centuries by collecting, storing, and managing every drop of rainwater that fell from the sky. What baffles archaeologists and hydrological engineers about el-Jimal is the sophistication of its water management system, a city-wide network of cisterns, reservoirs, channels, and catchment surfaces that collected rainwater from rooftops, streets, and the surrounding landscape and stored it in reservoirs of collectively enormous capacity. The most perplexing discovery is that this system apparently supported a population of several thousand people in a region that receives less than 100 millimeters of rainfall per year, an amount that by modern calculation should be entirely inadequate for urban life. How did the inhabitants of el-Jimal design a catchment system efficient enough to make a city viable in conditions of near-absolute aridity? And why, when the community eventually depopulated in the 7th and 8th centuries, did they not simply relocate to a more hospitable environment? As the evidence suggests, they had the means and connections to do. The civilizations that successively occupied el-Jimal, Nabatean, Roman, Byzantine, and early Islamic, all adapted to the site's particular constraints and opportunities. The Nabateans, the great desert traders of the ancient Near East, were already masters of water management when they first developed el-Jimal in the 1st centuries CE, and their techniques of rock-cut cisterns and landscape catchment formed the foundation on which later communities built. The Roman and Byzantine periods saw the town expand significantly, with multi-story basalt buildings, churches, barracks, and a cathedral whose black basalt masonry has survived in extraordinary preservation. The buildings at el-Jimal are remarkable in themselves. Corbelled rooms, sophisticated arches, carved doorways, all constructed entirely from the local basalt without mortar, relying entirely on careful stone fitting and gravity to maintain their structural integrity. The prevailing scholarly explanation for el-Jimal's success in an arid environment emphasizes the genius of Nabatean water technology. A tradition of desert water harvesting developed over centuries on the Arabian Peninsula and transmitted to communities throughout the Near Eastern desert belt. The Nabateans are known to have developed extraordinarily efficient systems for capturing and storing even minute quantities of precipitation, using techniques that were refined empirically over generations of desert living. el-Jimal inherited and extended this tradition, building what was, in effect, a giant water harvesting machine that could make urban life viable on a fraction of the rainfall available to conventional settlements. Others suggest that el-Jimal's persistence in an inhospitable environment reflects a spiritual as much as a practical commitment, that the community understood its survival in the desert not as a feat of engineering, but as evidence of divine favor, and that the maintenance of the city's water systems was understood as a religious obligation, a form of stewardship of a providential gift. The numerous churches and religious structures at the site suggest a deeply Christian community in the Byzantine period, and the desert, in the Christian tradition, was not a place to be escaped, but a place to be inhabited, a testing ground where faith and ingenuity could demonstrate their worth together. Could it be that the water management system at el-Jimal represents a body of practical knowledge, a sophisticated, empirically developed hydrological science that was never written down, was transmitted entirely through practice, and that was lost when the community finally dispersed? Some engineers have suggested that the full system at el-Jimal is more sophisticated than it appears at first analysis, that the arrangement of cisterns, the grading of catchment surfaces, and the design of overflow channels suggest a level of systems thinking that is genuinely impressive by any standard. How did the community at el-Jimal calculate how large their cisterns needed to be to see them through multi-year droughts? Why did they build in basalt, a material of extraordinary hardness and difficulty to work, rather than using the more workable limestone available nearby? Who were the engineers and planners who designed and maintained the city's water systems? And what tradition of knowledge did they represent? And when the city was finally abandoned, did the last inhabitants leave because the water system failed, or for entirely different reasons? El-Jimal stands as a testament to the extraordinary human capacity for adaptation, for finding ways to live and even to flourish in conditions that should by any reasonable assessment be uninhabitable. The black ruins rise from the black basalt plain, under a sky that is intensely blue, and the emptiness of the landscape makes the existence of this city feel all the more remarkable. They were here. They built something extraordinary in a place that offered almost nothing. The mystery is not how they survived. The mystery is what they knew that we have forgotten. We leave the black basalt city of Jordan behind and travel southeast into the Persian Gulf, to a Kuwaiti island where the ruins of a place that may have been visited by Alexander the Great himself lie beneath the sand, waiting for the next excavation season to yield their next surprise. The Persian Gulf is a flat, blue-green mirror in the early morning, and Failaka Island rises from it as a low, sandy profile on the horizon, a thin strip of land that seems almost too modest to have been significant, too small to have mattered. But the Gulf has a way of making the modest significant, the small enormous. The sea lanes that pass near this island have carried the world's commerce for 6,000 years, and the island has watched all of it pass. Failaka Island, located approximately 20 kilometers off the coast of Kuwait City in the northern Persian Gulf, is one of the most archaeologically layered small islands in the world. Evidence of human occupation here extends back to at least the 3rd millennium BCE, when the island formed part of the Dilmun trading network. The island subsequently came under Greek influence, following the campaigns of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. The Greeks named it Icaros and established a garrison and settlement there, and it has continued to yield artifacts and structures from the Bronze Age through the Islamic period. Its strategic position at the head of the Persian Gulf, controlling access to the great river systems of Mesopotamia, made it a place that every major power in the region wanted to hold. What baffles archaeologists about Failaka is the extraordinary density of its layering relative to its small size. An island of roughly 12 square kilometers that contains Bronze Age temples, a Greek fortified settlement with inscriptions mentioning Alexander, an Aramaic sanctuary, and multiple layers of Islamic occupation, all compressed into a remarkably small area. The most perplexing discovery is a series of Bronze Age temples and ritual structures that appear to have been in continuous use in adapted forms for over 2,000 years, a continuity of sacred function at specific locations on the island that persisted across complete changes of population, religion, and culture. Why did this particular island and these particular spots on it retain their sacred character through so many civilizational transitions? And what does this persistence of sacred geography tell us about the deep roots of religious experience? The cultures that occupied Failaka over the millennia were as varied as the colors of the Gulf's water. The earliest inhabitants, in the Bronze Age Dilmun period, built temples and conducted rituals that connected them to the same religious world as their contemporaries on the Bahraini mainland. The Greek Ikaros garrison, established under one of Alexander's successors, brought Hellenistic culture, complete with a temple to Artemis and Apollo and inscriptions in classical Greek, to a location that had previously been organized around entirely different cosmological principles. The Islamic period brought yet another cosmological framework, and yet the sacred spots persisted, accommodating each new theology in turn. Prevailing scholarly thinking on Failaka's sacred continuity points to the island's freshwater springs, an unusual hydrological feature in a region of predominantly saline groundwater, as the physical basis for its persistent sanctity. Springs in the ancient Near East were understood as openings in the boundary between the earthly and the underworld, places where the generative waters of the deep rose to the surface. A spring on an island in the middle of the sea was doubly liminal, doubly sacred, and may have attracted ritual attention regardless of the theological framework through which it was interpreted. Others suggest that Failaka's sacred persistence reflects something in the island's geographic position, its liminality between land and sea, between the familiar and the unknown, that made it a natural focus for the human need to mark and manage the boundaries of the known world. Island sanctuaries occupy a special place in many religious traditions, and Failaka may have been understood by every culture that encountered it as a place that stood between worlds. Some even wonder whether the continuity of sacred practice at Failaka across so many cultural transitions reflects the survival of a local priestly or custodial tradition, a community of keepers who maintained the sacred sites of the island even as the political powers around them changed, adapting the outward forms of worship to each new dominant culture while preserving something older, something unnamed at the core. What exactly did Alexander's commanders find on Failaka when they arrived in the 4th century BCE? Was there already a functioning sanctuary there? And if so, how did the Greek colonists respond to it? Why did the Greeks name the island Ikaros, a name with resonances of flight, hubris, and fatal ambition, rather than something more geographically descriptive? What ritual practices were performed in the Bronze Age temples, and who performed them? And why, given the island's extraordinary historical importance, has it been so dramatically underexplored by comparison with other sites in the region? Failaka Island stands as a testament to the persistent human need to mark certain places as sacred, to return to them, to rebuild on them, to invest them with meaning across the full span of recorded history. The island is small, the gulf around it is vast, and the sky above it is enormous. But the ruins speak of a place that for 6,000 years seemed to those who encountered it to stand at the very center of the world. From the waters of the Persian Gulf, we turn our gaze northward and eastward, deep into the heart of Central Asia, to the ancient crossroads of the Silk Road, where a city of scholars and saints once rose from the desert and left monuments whose reach extended from Spain to China. The Karakum Desert extends in every direction, an immensity of sand and silence, broken only by the wind and, in winter, by the extraordinary cold that descends from the steppes of Central Asia like a physical weight. The Amu Darya River, the ancient Oxus of classical geography, has shifted its course over the centuries, and the land that was once green and populated is now dry and empty. But the monuments remain. A minaret rises above the desert horizon, one of the tallest in the Islamic world, a pillar of fired brick that has stood for 8 centuries without apology. Kunya-Urgench, meaning Old Urgench in Turkmen, is an ancient city located in the northern Dashoguz province of Turkmenistan, near the border with Uzbekistan. It was the capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states in the medieval Islamic world, which at its height in the early 13th century controlled a vast territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Aral Sea. The city was one of the great centers of Islamic scholarship, commerce, and architecture during the period known in Islamic historiography as the Golden Age, a time when Central Asian scholars were preserving and extending the knowledge of the ancient world, while much of Europe lay in what historians have sometimes called intellectual dormancy. Kunya-Urgench was also, in 1221, utterly destroyed by the Mongol armies of Genghis Khan, its population massacred, its buildings leveled, its irrigation systems deliberately broken. UNESCO inscribed the surviving monuments as a World Heritage Site in 2005. What baffles historians about Kunya-Urgench is the completeness and swiftness of its intellectual and cultural recovery after the Mongol catastrophe, and then its second, equally catastrophic destruction under Timur in the 14th century. The most perplexing aspect of the site is the sheer intellectual density it represents. Kunya-Urgench produced or housed scholars of the caliber of al-Biruni and Ibn Sina, figures whose contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were so significant that they shaped the trajectory of world knowledge for centuries. How did a city in the middle of the Central Asian desert become one of the most important centers of human intellectual achievement in the medieval world? And what was lost irretrievably in the Mongol and Timurid destructions? The Khwarezmian civilization that built medieval Kunya-Urgench was a product of the extraordinary cultural ferment of the Islamic Golden Age, a world in which the translation movement had made the intellectual heritage of Greece, Persia, and India available in Arabic, and in which a class of professional scholars moved between courts and cities in search of patronage and peers. The Khwarezmian rulers were lavish patrons of learning, and the Mamun Academy in Kunya-Urgench, named after a Khwarezmian Shah who preceded the Abbasid Caliph of the same name, was, according to historical accounts, a gathering place for some of the greatest minds of the age, including al-Biruni and Ibn Sina themselves. The physical city that housed this intellectual life was, by all accounts, magnificent. The prevailing scholarly view of Kunya-Urgench's intellectual eminence connects it to its position at the crossroads of the Silk Road. The fact that the city stood at a point where the trade routes of China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean all converged meant that it was a natural collecting point not just for goods, but for ideas. Scholars, merchants, physicians, and engineers from across the known world passed through, and many stayed. The wealth generated by trade funded the patronage that attracted and sustained intellectual life. In this view, Kunya-Urgench was great because it was rich, and it was rich because of where it sat. Others suggest that the intellectual achievement of Kunya-Urgench reflects something more intrinsic, a particular quality of the Khwarezmian scholarly tradition, shaped by centuries of contact between the Persian, Turkic, and Arab intellectual worlds that produced a distinctive and unusually productive form of interdisciplinary inquiry. Al-Biruni's extraordinary range, geology, astronomy, mathematics, comparative religion, history, pharmacology, is difficult to explain entirely by reference to his geographic location, and may reflect the specific intellectual culture of a place that valued breadth as much as depth. Could it be that the libraries and archives of Kunya-Urgench, which the Mongols are recorded as having thrown into the Amu Darya River, contain texts that have never been recovered, texts that represented branches of knowledge whose loss has permanently impoverished human civilization? Al-Biruni alone is known to have written over 150 books. Fewer than 30 survive. What did the rest contain? What happened to the scholars and students who escaped the Mongol destruction? Did they carry their knowledge with them, or was it too embedded in physical texts to survive in memory alone? Why did the monuments of Kunya-Urgench, the minarets, the mausoleums, survive when the library and the living intellectual tradition did not? What would al-Biruni have thought, returning to find his city a UNESCO site visited by tourists in a country that did not exist in his lifetime? And is there any possibility that the texts thrown into the Amu Darya might, in extraordinary circumstances, have survived in some form? Kunya-Urgench stands as a testament to the fragility of intellectual achievement, to the ease with which centuries of accumulated knowledge can be destroyed in days of organized violence. The minaret still stands, pointing at the sky as it has for 800 years, outlasting the library, the academy, the empire, and the civilization that built it. The monuments remain. The knowledge they represented is, in large measure, gone. And the question of what we lost in the destruction of Kunya-Urgench is a question that has no comfortable answer. Continuing eastward along the ancient Silk Road, we now travel to one of its earliest and most unexpected waypoints, a Bronze Age city in Tajikistan so ancient that it predates almost everything we associate with Silk Road civilization, and yet already shows the hallmarks of long-distance trade and cultural exchange. The Zarafshan Valley cuts through the mountains of Tajikistan in a green ribbon of irrigated farmland, flanked by the bare grey ridges of the Pamir foothills. The air here smells of apricot blossoms in spring and cold mineral water running down from the glaciers. The valley has been farmed since prehistoric times, and the soil is deep and dark with millennia of cultivation. Somewhere in this valley, beneath a mound that for centuries no one thought to investigate, lay the oldest urban settlement in Central Asia. Sarazm is a proto-urban archaeological site located near the town of Penjikent in northwestern Tajikistan, on the left bank of the Zarafshan River. Excavations beginning in 1976 have revealed a settlement dating from approximately 3,500 BCE to 2000 BCE, making it roughly contemporaneous with the early Sumerian cities of Mesopotamia and the earliest phases of the Indus Valley civilization. The site covers approximately 100 hectares and contains the remains of monumental architecture, sophisticated craft production, and evidence of long-distance trade connections that extended from the steppes of Central Asia to the Persian Gulf and the Indian subcontinent. UNESCO inscribed Sarazm as a World Heritage Site in 2010, recognizing it as evidence for one of the earliest processes of urbanization in the heart of the Eurasian continent. What baffles archaeologists about Sarazm is the extraordinary reach of its trade connections at so early a date. The most perplexing discovery is the range of materials found at the site that could only have arrived through long-distance exchange. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, turquoise from Iran, or Central Asia, carnelian from India, and copper and tin that suggest connections with ore sources distributed across a vast geographic area. The site also yielded evidence of sophisticated metallurgy, including the production of bronze at a date that places it among the earliest bronze-working sites in Central Asia. How did a settlement of farmers and pastoralists in the Zeravshan Valley in the 4th millennium BCE develop and maintain trade relationships with communities thousands of kilometers away? And what does this network imply about the sophistication of communication, transportation, and social organization in prehistoric Central Asia? Sarazm was inhabited by a population that was, in economic terms, primarily agricultural and pastoral, growing wheat and barley in the valley's rich soils and herding cattle and sheep in the surrounding foothills. But the archaeological evidence suggests a social complexity well beyond the village level. Monumental buildings interpreted as administrative or ritual centers, evidence of craft specialization, including metallurgy, ceramics, and possibly textile production, and the distribution of prestige goods that implies a social hierarchy with the ability to accumulate and redistribute wealth. The people of Sarazm were, in a meaningful sense, proto-urban, not yet living in true cities, but already organizing their society along the lines that would produce cities within a few centuries. The prevailing scholarly interpretation of Sarazm's trade connections emphasizes the role of the Zeravshan Valley itself as a natural corridor, a geographic highway through the mountains of Central Asia that connected the western steppes with the agricultural zones of Bactria, and beyond them with the trade networks of Iran and the Gulf. Sarazm, in this reading, was not an anomalous center of long-distance exchange, but a natural waypoint on a route that was already being used for the movement of goods across vast distances. The site's metallurgical activity suggests it may have been a processing center, a place where raw ores from the surrounding mountains were worked into tradable ingots or finished objects. Others suggest that Sarazm's importance was not merely geographic, but cosmological, that the site occupied a position in the conceptual geography of the ancient world that made it a place of intersection, a node in a network of sacred as well as commercial relationships. The monumental buildings at the site have been interpreted by some researchers as temples or ritual centers, suggesting that the exchange of goods at Sarazm was embedded in a framework of ceremonial obligation and supernatural sanction, as it was in many ancient trading centers. Some even wonder whether the evidence from Sarazm implies the existence of a prehistoric communication network across Central Asia, a world of shared knowledge, shared materials, and perhaps shared cosmological ideas that predates the historical Silk Road by 2,000 years. Could the Silk Road, in some sense, have been not an invention of the Han Chinese and their Roman counterparts, but a formalization of roots and relationships that had been functioning in less documented forms since the Bronze Age? Who were the merchants or emissaries who carried lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to the Zeravshan Valley? Were they professional long-distance traders, or were the goods passing from community to community through a chain of local exchanges? What ritual significance, if any, attached to the lapis lazuli, the turquoise, and the carnelian that were traded across these enormous distances? Were they primarily prestige goods, or were they materials with specific cosmological significance? And why did Sarazm apparently decline and depopulate around 2000 BCE? What changed in the economic, climatic, or social conditions of the Zeravshan Valley to make the site no longer viable? Sarazm stands as a testament to the astonishing antiquity of long-distance human connection, to the fact that even 5,000 years ago, the humans of Central Asia were not isolated communities living in geographic and cultural isolation, but participants in networks of exchange that spanned thousands of kilometers. The story of the Silk Road begins far earlier than the history books have told us. Sarazm is the first chapter, and we have barely learned to read it. From the ancient trading post of the Zarafshan Valley, our journey now swings southward and westward, crossing the vast interior of the Asian continent to reach the high plateau of East Africa, to an ancient city in Eritrea that stands at a crossroads of civilizations almost as complex as Sarazm's own. The plateau here, 4 kilometers above sea level, is swept by a wind that comes straight off the Red Sea highlands, cold and dry and carrying the smell of African sage. The sky is enormous, as it always is at altitude, and the landscape has that quality of spare, elemental clarity that belongs to high places everywhere, rock and sky, and the undeceiving light of altitude. And scattered across this plateau, as if placed there by an act of geological whimsy, are the ruins of a city that almost no one in the Western world has heard of. Qohaito, also spelled Qohaito, is an ancient city located on the southeastern escarpment of the Eritrean highlands, at an altitude of approximately 2,600 meters above sea level, roughly 120 kilometers south of the Eritrean capital Asmara. The site contains the ruins of a substantial pre-Aksumite and Aksumite period city that flourished between roughly 400 BCE and 700 CE, including a large dam, a temple of Aksumite design known as the Temple of Mariam Wakiro, a significant number of rock-carved cisterns, a variety of architectural remains, and what may be one of the earliest and most sophisticated water management systems in sub-Saharan Africa. Qohaito stands at the intersection of the ancient trade routes, connecting the Red Sea coast with the interior of Africa, routes that carried incense, ivory, gold, and slaves between the Mediterranean world and sub-Saharan Africa for over 1,000 years. What baffles archaeologists about Qohaito is the combination of its altitude, its water infrastructure, and the sophistication of its urban design, all of which suggest a level of technical and organizational capacity that sits poorly with the relative obscurity of the site in the historical record. The most perplexing discovery is the dam, the Safira Dam, a structure approximately 60 meters long and 4 to 5 meters high, built to impound water on a plateau where rainfall is highly seasonal and long dry seasons are the norm. The dam, combined with the rock-cut cisterns and the evidence of channeled water distribution across the site, suggests that Qohaito possessed a hydraulic infrastructure comparable to any in the ancient world at the same period. How did a city at 2,600 meters altitude, without access to any permanent river, sustain a substantial population for over 1,000 years through water engineering alone? And why does no major historical source give Qohaito the attention its infrastructure suggests it deserves? The civilization that built and inhabited Qohaito was part of the broader Aksumite cultural world, the Kingdom of Aksum, which flourished in the northern Horn of Africa between roughly 100 and 940 CE and was, at its height, one of the most powerful states in the ancient world. Aksum controlled the Red Sea trade routes between Rome, Arabia, India, and sub-Saharan Africa, and its rulers were wealthy enough to build monumental stelae, towering obelisks, that rank among the greatest stone monuments of the ancient world. Qohaito predates the rise of Aksum proper, and its pre-Aksumite remains suggest a sophisticated culture in the Eritrean highlands that was already well developed before the Aksumite state emerged. The religious life of the pre-Aksumite inhabitants included the worship of the South Arabian deity al-Makka, indicating strong cultural connections with the Arabian Peninsula across the Red Sea. The prevailing scholarly view of Qohaito's function emphasizes its role as a regional, administrative, and commercial center. A waypoint on the incense trade routes, a place where goods moving between the Red Sea coast and the African interior could be stored, taxed, and redistributed. Its altitude made it a relatively cool and defensible location in a hot and contested landscape, and its water infrastructure allowed it to function as a reliable supply point for caravans. The dam and cisterns in this view were essentially infrastructure investments, the hydraulic equivalent of a caravanserai, designed to make the site a viable stopping point in an otherwise arid landscape. Others suggest that Qohaito's high altitude and its association with the worship of sky deities reflects a specifically cosmological logic in its foundation, that the city was placed at the edge of the escarpment not primarily for practical reasons, but because this place, where the highlands meet the sky and the horizon stretches to the Red Sea, was understood as a sacred boundary. High places in many religious traditions are understood as the dwelling places of gods, or as the closest points of contact between earth and heaven. Qohaito may have been founded and sustained as much by this cosmological logic as by any commercial calculation. Could it be that Qohaito's relative obscurity in the historical record is a consequence of the profound underrepresentation of sub-Saharan African archaeology in the global scholarly literature? That the site has not received the attention it deserves simply because the frameworks and resources of modern archaeology have been systematically concentrated elsewhere? Some Eritrean archaeologists have argued precisely this, pointing out that Qohaito is as significant and as complex as many sites in the Near East that command enormous scholarly attention. Who designed the Saphira Dam, and what tradition of hydraulic knowledge did they draw on? Why did the pre-Aksumite inhabitants of Qohaito worship a South Arabian deity? What kind of cultural relationship across the Red Sea does this imply? What happened to the city when the Aksumite state declined in the 7th and 8th centuries CE? Was it abandoned gradually or suddenly? And how many similar sites, equally significant and equally underexplored, might still be waiting to be found across the Eritrean highlands? Qohaito stands as a testament to the depth of African civilization and to the systematic neglect with which that depth has been treated by the mainstream of global scholarship. The ruins on the high plateau are real. The dam is real. The cisterns are real. The sophistication is real. What is not yet real, not yet fully present in the global conversation about the ancient world, is a proper accounting of what Qohaito means, and of what it means that it has been overlooked for so long. From the heights of the Eritrean plateau, our journey now sweeps eastward across the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal, returning to the tropical world of Southeast Asia, to a Cambodian site that predates even Angkor, and that may hold the key to understanding where the entire Khmer architectural tradition came from. The trees here are enormous, ancient, root-spreading dipterocarp and fig trees that have grown through and over the stone for more than 1,200 years. Their roots embrace collapsed towers the way water embraces a stone dropped in a pool, slowly, completely, with absolute indifference to the architecture's original intentions. Vines drape the carved surfaces. The light is green and diffused. A smell of wet earth and stone, and something older, something mineral and dark, rises from the jungle floor around the ruins. Sambor Prei Kuk, which translates from Khmer as the temple in the richness of the forest, is an archaeological site located in Kampong Tom province in central Cambodia, approximately 176 kilometers north of Phnom Penh. It was the capital of the pre-Angkorian Chinla kingdom, which dominated much of mainland Southeast Asia from the 6th to the 9th centuries CE, and it is widely recognized as the site where the distinctly Cambodian tradition of temple architecture, the tradition that would culminate in the glories of Angkor, first developed and matured. The complex comprises more than 100 temples and shrines, constructed primarily in brick and stone between the late 6th and early 8th centuries CE, and it was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2017 as the most important site of the pre-Angkorian period. What baffles archaeologists and architectural historians about Sambor Prei Kuk is the sophistication of its architectural innovation, specifically the appearance at this site of decorative and structural techniques that represent a sudden dramatic leap beyond what had come before, with no clear antecedent tradition from which they could have developed organically. The most perplexing discovery involves the so-called flying palaces, carved stone medallions depicting multi-story celestial palaces suspended in mid-air by chains held by divine beings, which appear at Sambor Prei Kuk with a complexity and artistry that seems, by all normal developmental logic, to require a longer period of artistic evolution than the evidence allows. Where did this tradition come from, so fully formed? And what does the sudden appearance of these motifs tell us about the cultural contacts and knowledge flows of 6th century Cambodia? The Chenla kingdom that built Sambor Prei Kuk was a Sanskrit-speaking Shaivite Hindu state whose rulers were regarded as incarnations of the god Shiva, and whose religious and cultural models were derived from the Indian subcontinent. The process by which Indian cultural forms, Sanskrit writing, Hindu cosmology, Indian temple design, were transmitted to mainland Southeast Asia is known to scholars as Indianization, though the degree to which this was active imposition or local adoption remains debated. What is clear is that by the time of Sambor Prei Kuk, Cambodian society had so thoroughly absorbed and re-elaborated these Indian influences that something genuinely new, a distinctly Cambodian visual and architectural language, was already in the process of being born. The prevailing scholarly view of Sambor Prei Kuk's architectural innovation emphasizes the role of direct contact with Indian craftsmen and merchants, the possibility that skilled artisans from the Indian subcontinent came to Cambodia either as missionaries, traders, or court retainers, and brought with them both technical knowledge and design templates that the local tradition then adapted and extended. The sea routes between India and Southeast Asia were already well established by the 1st century CE, and the movement of people, goods, and ideas along these routes was constant and substantial. Others suggest that the architectural innovations of Sambor Prei Kuk represent a more profound creative synthesis, not mere borrowing from Indian models, but a genuine reimagining of Indian cosmological principles in response to the specific physical and spiritual conditions of the Cambodian landscape. The flying palaces of Sambor Prei Kuk in this reading are not derivative, but original, a Cambodian vision of the celestial world that draws on Indian iconography but speaks in a distinctly local voice. Some researchers even wonder whether the sudden sophistication of Sambor Prei Kuk's architecture implies the involvement of a highly skilled artisan tradition, perhaps from India, perhaps from elsewhere, that arrived in Cambodia with a fully formed design vocabulary and transmitted it in a concentrated burst rather than through the gradual processes of cultural diffusion that normally characterize such transfers. Who designed the first temples at Sambor Prei, and what tradition of training or apprenticeship had they undergone? Why did the Chenla capital move away from this site in the 9th century? Was it political instability, environmental change, or some more obscure cosmological logic? What do the unexcavated mounds and buried structures within the Sambor Prei complex contain? Are there earlier phases of construction beneath the visible ruins? And what is the precise relationship between the architectural vocabulary developed here and the later, more famous vocabulary of Angkor? Sambor Prei stands as a testament to the creative energy of cultural encounter, to the extraordinary things that can happen when one tradition of thought and art meets another in a landscape that offers new materials, new challenges, and new spiritual imperatives. The jungle here is doing what jungles do: reclaiming, incorporating, converting stone to soil and art to humus. But the carvings on the towers, the flying palaces, the guardian figures, the intricate vine scroll decorations are still visible under the moss, still insisting on their sophistication, still asking to be fully understood. We leave the pre-Angkorian forests of Cambodia and travel northwest across the length of the Eurasian continent to a very different kind of mystery, to a place in the Balkans where extraordinary claims about the nature of an ordinary-looking hill have divided the archaeological community and fascinated the world. The hills around Visoko rise in shapes that are, to a certain eye, geometrically suspicious. Their slopes are too regular, their faces too flat, their alignments too cardinal point precise to feel entirely natural. The valley below is a quiet Bosnian landscape of farmland and river and Ottoman-era towns, entirely unremarkable by the standard of a region that has seen the rise and fall of empires. But these hills, these very ordinary-looking hills, have become the focus of one of the most contentious archaeological debates of the 21st century. The so-called Bosnian Pyramid Complex is a collection of hills in the Visoko Valley of central Bosnia and Herzegovina, approximately 30 kilometers northwest of Sarajevo, which a Bosnian-American archaeologist named Semir Osmanagic claimed, beginning in 2005, to be the remains of the largest prehistoric pyramid complex in the world. The most prominent hill, Visočica, which bears the Bosnian medieval town of Visoki on its summit, has been designated the Pyramid of the Sun and is claimed to be larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The complex has attracted enormous popular attention, significant private investment in ongoing excavations, and fierce, nearly unanimous rejection from the mainstream archaeological and geological community. The site is, depending on whom you ask, either the most important archaeological discovery of the modern era or a dramatic misrepresentation of natural landforms. What makes the Bosnian pyramid site so genuinely perplexing, regardless of where one stands on the central claim, is the nature of the material that has been uncovered in the excavations conducted since 2005. The most discussed discovery involves what appear to be paved surfaces of sandstone slabs and concrete-like material found on the slopes of Visočica and the adjacent hills. The composition of this material has been analyzed by several independent laboratories, and some analyses have concluded that it contains properties, including a compressive strength reportedly exceeding that of modern concrete, that are difficult to explain as purely natural formations. Are these surfaces man-made, or are they the product of natural geological processes that created concrete-like conglomerates? And if they are man-made, What civilization made them, and when? The geological setting of Visoko is complex. The hills rise from a valley that has experienced multiple phases of geological deformation, and the rock types present in the area include sandstones, siltstones, and conglomerates that can, under specific conditions, form horizontal layers that superficially resemble paving. The region's tectonic history has produced geometric fracturing and tilting of these layers that can, to a non-specialist eye, suggest human construction. The valley was also inhabited in the medieval period, and the summit of Visočica bears the documented remains of a medieval Bosnian fort, evidence that human construction has indeed occurred on the hill, even if the hill itself is natural. The prevailing position of the mainstream archaeological and geological community is unambiguous. The hills of Visoko are natural landforms, the result of geological processes, including tectonic deformation, erosion, and the natural tendency of certain rock types to form regular, layered structures. The European Association of Archaeologists issued a statement in 2006 describing the pyramid claims as a cruel hoax that diverted resources from genuine archaeological work. Geologists who have examined the site have consistently concluded that the observed regularities are consistent with known, natural processes in the region's geological history and do not require any human agency to explain. Others, and these include some researchers with genuine credentials in relevant fields, maintain that the specific composition of the paved surfaces, the regularity of their extent, and the presence of what appear to be tunnels beneath the hills cannot be fully explained by natural processes alone. They argue that the mainstream rejection of the pyramid hypothesis has been more categorical than the evidence strictly warrants, and that the site deserves more rigorous, open-minded investigation rather than dismissal based on the implausibility of the central claim. The tunnels in particular, a network of underground passages that appear to extend beneath the hills for considerable distances, have been the subject of ongoing investigation and remain genuinely difficult to explain. Could it be that the hills of Visoko, while not pyramids in any conventional sense, do contain evidence of human modification or use, perhaps of a much more modest kind than Osmanagic's central claim, but nonetheless real and potentially significant? The history of archaeology is not without examples of mainstream consensus being wrong about specific sites, and the lesson of that history is perhaps to maintain a degree of epistemic humility even in the face of extraordinary claims. Why does the concrete-like material on the slopes of Visočica have a compressive strength that several independent analyses have found remarkable? What is the full extent and origin of the tunnel system beneath the hills? Are these natural cave formations, Ottoman or medieval mine workings, or something else? If the hills are entirely natural, what accounts for the specific geometric regularity of their slopes and alignments? And what does the passion with which this site has been both promoted and attacked tell us about the deep human hunger for a version of the ancient past that is more complex, more mysterious, and more technically accomplished than the one standard archaeology provides? The Bosnian pyramid complex stands as a testament to the power of mystery, to the way in which an unresolved question, especially one that touches on the deepest human desire to know our own origins, can generate both extraordinary creativity and extraordinary controversy. Whether the hills of Visoko are pyramids, modified landforms, or simply hills, the questions they have raised about the limits of our knowledge of prehistoric Europe are real, and in that sense, at least, the mystery is genuine. We leave the contested hills of Bosnia behind and travel southeast, crossing the Arabian Peninsula to a desert valley in northwestern Saudi Arabia, where an ancient city carved into rose-colored sandstone cliffs has emerged from centuries of restricted access to reveal one of the most spectacular and least-known archaeological landscapes in the world. The sandstone cliffs glow in the evening light, ochre and rose and deep crimson, layered and wind-carved into shapes that look simultaneously geological and architectural, as if the desert itself has been working on this landscape as a sculptor for 10 million years and has not yet decided whether it is finished. The valley floor is green with date palms, fed by artesian wells that have been sustaining life here since the Neolithic. The air is dry and crystalline, and the silence is total except for the wind in the palms and the distant sound of stone settling in the heat. Al-ULA is a region and a city in the Medina province of northwestern Saudi Arabia, occupying a narrow valley in the Hijaz Mountains, approximately 1,100 kilometers northwest of Riyadh. It is one of the most archaeologically significant areas in the Arabian Peninsula, a landscape that contains the remains of multiple successive civilizations, from prehistoric rock art to the ancient city of Dadan, capital of the Lihianite Kingdom, to the Nabatean city of Hegra, also known as Madain Saleh, to the later Islamic Old City of al-ULA. The region was restricted to outside visitors for most of the 20th century due to its proximity to Medina, but has undergone a dramatic opening in recent years as part of Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 tourism initiative, and the archaeological revelations emerging from systematic survey and excavation are only beginning to be processed. What baffles archaeologists about Dadan, the most ancient and least known of al-ULA's civilizational layers, is the sophistication of the Lihianite Kingdom at a period when almost nothing was known about it. The most perplexing discovery involves a series of monumental lion sculptures associated with the Bagan Temple complex, large, carefully carved stone lions that formed an avenue of approach to the sanctuary, reminiscent in their arrangement of the lion avenues at Luxor or Delos. Who were the Lihianites, the kingdom that made these sculptures? What was the nature of their religious life? And why did the lion, a creature not native to northwestern Arabia, play such a central role in their iconography? And what happened to a civilization so apparently sophisticated that it has left almost no trace in the broader historical memory? The civilizations of al-ULA existed at the intersection of some of the most important trade routes of the ancient world. The incense routes that carried frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean passed through this valley, and the kingdoms that controlled al-ULA, Dadan, and later Hegra were wealthy from the taxes and services they provided to the caravans. Dadan appears in Assyrian texts of the 8th century BCE and in the Hebrew Bible as a trading center of significance. The Lihianites, who dominated the site from roughly the 6th to the 2nd centuries BCE, were a sophisticated society with their own script, their own religious traditions, and their own artistic conventions. A full civilization that has been almost entirely overlooked in the standard narratives of the ancient Near East. The prevailing scholarly view of the Lihianite kingdom and the city of Dadan emphasizes the role of incense trade wealth in funding the monumental constructions found at the site. The lion sculptures, the temple complex, and the numerous inscriptions and rock carvings found in the valley all point to a society with substantial surplus, the kind of surplus that only the control of a major trade route can generate. The lions, in this view, are status symbols, expensive, difficult to carve, and powerful in their symbolic association with kingship and divine protection. Others suggest that the religious life of Dadan was far more complex and cosmologically sophisticated than the incense trade explanation implies, that the Lihyanite cult of the lion, combined with evidence for the worship of a deity known as Du-Gabat, reflects a distinctive Arabian religious cosmology that drew on, but was not reducible to, the traditions of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Arabian Peninsula. The region around al-ULA contains thousands of pre-Islamic rock inscriptions in multiple scripts, Dadanitic, Nabatean, Thamudic, that together constitute one of the richest collections of pre-Islamic Arabian epigraphic material in the world, and it is only beginning to be fully studied. Could it be that the archaeological landscape of al-ULA contains evidence of a civilizational sequence, from Neolithic settlement, through Lihyanite kingdom, through Nabatean city, through early Islamic settlement, that will fundamentally revise our understanding of the role of the Arabian Peninsula in the development of the ancient world? The restricted access that has kept al-ULA out of mainstream archaeology for most of the 20th century means that what is now emerging is, in a very real sense, a new chapter of world history being written in real time. Who were the craftsmen who carved the Lion Avenue of Dadan? Were they local, or were they brought from elsewhere? Why does the Lihyanite script, which is one of the oldest alphabetic scripts in the region, appear in the al-ULA Valley in such abundance and then essentially disappear from the historical record? What relationship did the Lihyanite kingdom have with the contemporary civilizations of Egypt, Babylon, and Persia? Were they trading partners, tributaries, rivals? And what lies beneath the date palm gardens of the valley floor, in the unexcavated layers that must contain the material culture of thousands of years of continuous human habitation? Al-ULA and ancient Dadan stand as a testament to the extraordinary capacity of restricted access to preserve the past. The paradox that a site can be better preserved precisely because it has been overlooked, and that the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century may come not from newly discovered locations, but from well-known places that have simply never been fully investigated. The valley is opening, the excavations are accelerating, and the picture of the ancient Arabian world that is emerging from the sandstone cliffs of al-ULA is more complex, more surprising, and more beautiful than anyone anticipated. From the rose-colored desert of northwestern Saudi Arabia, we travel southwest across the Pacific to the high Andes of Peru, to a site where the sounds of the ancient world are literally carved into the stone, and where the rituals of an Andean civilization older than the Inca left permanent marks on the landscape and in the human imagination. The Andes here rise to over 5,000 meters, their glaciated peaks catching the morning cloud in ragged white banners. The valley below, the Mosna and Huachexa rivers, meeting at approximately 3,150 meters above sea level, is cold even in summer, the air thin and crystalline, the light at altitude flattening the landscape into a series of sharp plains. The stone here is gray-white granite, quarried from the mountains and dragged to this valley floor to build something that was, for over 1,000 years, one of the most powerful religious centers in the Andean world. Chavin de Huantar is an archaeological site in the Ancash region of the Peruvian Andes, at the confluence of two rivers in a high mountain valley. The site contains the remains of a major ceremonial center built by the Chavin culture, which flourished between approximately 900 and 200 BCE, and is widely considered the first major Pan-Andean civilization, a cultural horizon that spread its iconographic and religious traditions across an enormous geographic area from the Pacific coast to the Amazon basin. The site includes a complex of stone platforms and plazas, a sunken circular court, and an extraordinary labyrinthine system of underground galleries and passages that runs beneath and through the main temple complex. UNESCO designated it a World Heritage Site in 1985, recognizing it as a unique artistic achievement and as the origin point of a cultural tradition that shaped Andean civilization for over 1,000 years after the Chavin Horizon itself ended. What baffles archaeologists and acoustic scientists about Chavin de Huantar is the sophisticated manipulation of sound in its underground gallery system. The most perplexing discovery involves the acoustic properties of the galleries, specifically that the labyrinthine passages create disorienting acoustic effects, including sound doubling, echoing, and reverberation, that recent research has demonstrated would have been dramatically intensified by the ritual use of Strombus shell trumpets, whose presence at the site is attested by archaeological finds. Acoustic analysis of the gallery system has revealed that it was almost certainly designed, at least in part, to produce specific auditory effects that, combined with hallucinogenic plant consumption evidenced by botanical remains at the site, would have created a profoundly disorienting sensory environment for ritual participants. Who designed a building for sound in this way 3,000 years ago? And what does the sophistication of this acoustic engineering tell us about the architects of Chavin's understanding of the relationship between sound, space, and religious experience? The Chavin culture that built this site was a theocratic civilization centered on the worship of a deity known today as the staff god, a supernatural being depicted on stone and textile with fanged jaws, clawed feet, and a staff in each hand, flanked by attendant figures. The Chavin iconographic tradition spread across the Andean world with a speed and thoroughness that implies not military conquest, but the success of a religious movement. A spiritual offering, perhaps, that answered needs and addressed anxieties felt across a wide geographic area. The ceremonial center at Chavin de Huantar was the source of this tradition, a pilgrimage destination to which people came from distant coasts and valleys to participate in rituals whose nature we can only partially reconstruct. The prevailing scholarly interpretation of Chavin de Huantar's ritual function emphasizes the role of sensory manipulation in the production of transformative religious experience. The underground galleries, the acoustic effects, the architectural disorientation, the botanical hallucinogens, the trumpet music. Together, these created an environment specifically designed to dissolve ordinary perception and induce states of consciousness that were interpreted as divine encounter. The Chavin priests, in this view, were not merely religious officials, but engineers of experience, architects of a carefully calibrated environment for the production of altered states. Others suggest that the Chavin ceremonial system reflects a sophisticated cosmological understanding, a model of the universe in which the underground passages represented the paths of the dead, the sound of the trumpets represented the voices of the ancestors, and the entire complex was a machine for communication between the living and the dead, the human and the divine. The underground galleries, so deliberately confusing, so acoustically strange, may have been understood as a literal underworld, a place where the boundaries between realms were thin enough to cross. Could it be that the acoustic design of Chavin de Huantar represents a body of knowledge, a practical science of sound and space, that was developed through systematic experimentation over generations and that has left no explicit record? The precision of the acoustic effects suggests a level of intentionality that, if fully understood, would represent a remarkable chapter in the history of human knowledge about the physics of sound. What happened to the priests and ritual specialists of Chavin de Huantar when the site was eventually abandoned around 200 BCE? Did they carry their knowledge elsewhere, founding new ritual centers, or did the tradition die with the place? Why did the Chavin iconographic tradition spread so rapidly and so widely across the Andean world? What specific psychological or spiritual need did the staff god address that made it so universally compelling? What is in the still unexcavated portions of the underground gallery system? And what might those unexplored passages reveal about the full extent of Chavin's ritual program? And could the acoustic properties of other ancient ceremonial sites around the world, Newgrange, Stonehenge, the temples of Malta, reflect a similar cross-cultural understanding of the ritual power of sound in enclosed spaces? Chavin de Huantar stands as a testament to the profound sophistication of religious architecture, to the human capacity to build environments that do not merely host religious experience, but actively produce it, shaping consciousness through the deliberate manipulation of space, sound, and light. The galleries are still there. The stone faces of the Lanzon, the great carved stela at the heart of the underground system, still watches from its chamber. And the question of what was heard in those passages, what was seen, and what was understood, remains as open as the Andean sky above the valley. From the high Andes of Peru, our journey carries us eastward, across the Pacific, and deep into the Indian subcontinent, to a site on the Balochistan plain of Pakistan that contains the earliest known evidence of the agricultural and craft traditions that would eventually give rise to one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations. The Kachi Plain of Balochistan stretches flat and stony beneath a sky that in summer becomes a white-hot dome of heat. The Bolan Pass cuts through the mountains to the northwest, the same pass that has been the primary gateway between Central Asia and the South Asian subcontinent for as long as humans have been moving between the two. The wind comes through the pass, carrying dust and the smell of distant mountains. And here, in this pass-mouth plain, where the highlands meet the lowlands and the mountains meet the river, is where it seems to have begun. Mehrgarh is a Neolithic and Chalcolithic site located in the Balochistan province of Pakistan, at the foot of the Bolan Pass, approximately 150 kilometers from the city of Quetta. Excavations begun by French archaeologists in 1974 have revealed that the site was continuously inhabited from approximately 7000 BCE to around 2500 BCE, making it one of the earliest known farming settlements in South Asia, and a site whose significance extends far beyond its region. Mehrgarh is now understood as a Proto-Indus Valley site, a place where, over thousands of years, the agricultural, craft, and social traditions that would eventually crystallize into the Indus Valley civilization were first developed. At Mehrgarh, archaeologists have found the earliest known evidence of cotton cultivation, the earliest known dentistry in the human archaeological record, and a ceramic tradition of increasing sophistication that traces the full trajectory from simple handmade pots to the elegant, wheel-thrown wares of the mature Indus period. What baffles archaeologists about Mehrgarh most profoundly is the evidence of dentistry, specifically the discovery that at least 11 individuals buried at the site had teeth that had been drilled, apparently with a bow drill technology using flint drill heads, with such precision that the drillings show evidence of curvature correction. of reaching decay in interior dental tissue, and in some cases of being drilled into living teeth. The most perplexing aspect of this discovery is its date. The dental work at Mehrgarh was being performed between approximately 7,500 and 5,500 BCE, making it not only the earliest known dental practice in the world, but a practice of startling technical sophistication at an incredibly early date. What was the purpose of this drilling? Was it therapeutic? Was it cosmological? Was it a form of body modification with social or spiritual significance? And what body of anatomical knowledge did it presuppose? The community at Mehrgarh that produced this evidence was a Neolithic farming village in the process of developing from a small, semi-nomadic community into a permanent, increasingly complex settlement. The earliest inhabitants herded cattle, sheep, and goats, and grew wheat, barley, and dates. Over the millennia, Mehrgarh grew in size and complexity, developing specialized craft production in ceramics, basketry, and eventually copperworking. The settlement shows evidence of long-distance trade. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, shell from the Arabian Sea coast, that links it, even at this early date, to the broader network of exchange that characterized the ancient world of South and Central Asia. The prevailing scholarly interpretation of the Mehrgarh dental practice emphasizes empirical experimentation. The possibility that the community developed rudimentary dental intervention through direct observation of the relationship between tooth decay, pain, and the structure of the tooth, and that the bow drill technology already in use for bead making and fire starting was adapted for dental purposes. The fact that 11 drilled teeth have been identified suggests that this was not an accidental discovery, but a practice technique passed down through some form of apprenticeship or craft transmission. Others suggest that the dental work at Mehrgarh had a ritual as well as a practical dimension, that the drilling of teeth was understood not merely as medical intervention, but as a cosmological act, a modification of the body that marked participation in a specific social or spiritual status. In many prehistoric societies, body modification, including dental modification, was a marker of adulthood, of group membership, or of cosmological alignment. The drilled teeth of Mehrgarh may have been as much about identity as about health. Some researchers wonder whether the skill level demonstrated at Mehrgarh implies a level of accumulated anatomical knowledge, a tradition of observing, recording, and transmitting information about the human body that seems strikingly sophisticated for the 7th millennium BCE. Could Mehrgarh have been, among other things, an early center of medical knowledge in the broadest sense? Who were the practitioners who performed the dental work at Mehrgarh? Were they specialists, proto-physicians, or was this a more widely distributed skill? What became of the agricultural and craft knowledge developed at Mehrgarh over 5,000 years of continuous occupation? Is it directly ancestral to the traditions of the Indus Valley civilization, or were there ruptures and discontinuities in the transmission? Why did Mehrgarh eventually decline and depopulate as the Indus Valley civilization was rising? Was there a connection between the two processes? And what lies in the unexcavated portions of this site, which covers an enormous area and has only been partially investigated? Mehrgarh stands as a testament to the extraordinary antiquity of human technical and intellectual achievement, to the fact that the capacity for systematic observation, for the development and transmission of skilled practice, and for the organization of complex social life was already fully present in the human toolkit more than 9,000 years ago. The farmers of the Kachi Plain were not primitive. They were the beginning. From the Neolithic plain of Balochistan, we travel north and east across the full breadth of the Asian continent, to the far northeast of China, to a site on the Liao River plain that has revealed a prehistoric ritual complex of enormous scale and entirely unexpected sophistication in a region that mainstream history long assumed to have been peripheral to the development of Chinese civilization. The hills of western Liaoning province rise in gentle ridges above the Liao River plain, their slopes covered in summer with a thin grassland that trembles in the wind from Mongolia. The landscape is open and dry, with a quality of vast, austere quietness that belongs to the transitional zones between steppe and agricultural plain. Beneath the hills, preserved in the desiccated soil for 5,500 years, are the remains of a ritual world so sophisticated and so unexpected that its discovery in the 1980s forced a fundamental revision of what was known about the origins of Chinese civilization. Niuheliang is a Neolithic archaeological site located in Chaoyang City in Liaoning Province, northeastern China. It belongs to the Hongshan culture, a Neolithic civilization that flourished in the region of what is now Inner Mongolia and northeastern China between approximately 4,500 and 3,000 BCE. The Niuheliang site complex consists of a series of ceremonial mounds, stone-lined burial cairns, and most significantly, the remains of a large structure known as the Goddess Temple, a building constructed partly underground, containing fragments of large-scale clay figurines, including a female face of exceptional artistry and a series of clay bears that suggest a sophisticated religious iconography. The site also contains significant numbers of jade artifacts, including the distinctive Hongshan pig dragon form known as the Zhulong, of extraordinary craftsmanship. Niuheliang has fundamentally revised the understanding of Neolithic northeastern China, demonstrating that a complex ceremonial civilization existed here 2,000 years before the traditionally recognized cradle of Chinese civilization in the Yellow River Valley. What baffles archaeologists about Niuheliang is the combination of the goddess temple's apparent scale and complexity with the absence of any contemporaneous urban settlement in the surrounding area. The most perplexing aspect of the site is that the ceremonial complex, with its large ritual buildings, its elaborate burial cairns, its fine jade objects, appears to have been a dedicated ritual landscape rather than the sacred center of an urban civilization. The people who built and used Niuheliang were apparently not city dwellers, but semi-sedentary farming and herding communities who came together at this location specifically and solely for ceremonial purposes. How did a non-urban society organize the labor, the craft specialization, and the sustained institutional continuity needed to maintain a ceremonial complex of this scale and sophistication over hundreds of years? And what does the existence of this complex tell us about the relationship between religion, social organization, and urban life in prehistoric societies? The Hongshan culture that created Niuheliang was a farming society of northern China, growing millet and raising pigs in the river valleys of Liaoning and Inner Mongolia, but also maintaining a pastoral dimension that involved herding and movement across the steppe margins. Hongshan society appears to have been organized, at least at the level of ceremonial life, by a priestly or shamanic elite. Burials at Niuheliang and other Hongshan sites show clear evidence of social stratification, with high-status individuals interred with jade objects and others apparently buried with nothing. The jade objects of the Hongshan culture worked into forms of extraordinary delicacy from one of the hardest materials available to Neolithic craftsmen, represent a peak of jade-working skill that was not surpassed for thousands of years. The prevailing scholarly view of Niuheliang's function interprets it as a sacred landscape, a pilgrimage destination or ceremonial gathering place for the dispersed Hongshan communities of the region. The goddess temple, in this view, was a focus of ancestor worship or fertility cult, and the burial cairns surrounding it were reserved for the elite dead who were understood to have a special relationship with the goddess and the sacred landscape. The jade objects, deposited in significant numbers in the high-status burials, were likely understood as markers of cosmic connection, objects that linked their possessors to the divine order represented by the temple and its deity. Others suggest that the goddess temple at Niuheliang represents a tradition of female divine power, a goddess religion that was widespread across Eurasia in the Neolithic period, and that the Hongshan culture may have been connected to this broader spiritual world through networks of contact and exchange that archaeology has not yet fully mapped. The clay female figurines of Niuheliang have been compared to the Venus figurines of Paleolithic and Neolithic Europe, and some researchers see in both a shared, transcontinental tradition of goddess veneration that predates the male-dominated cosmologies of the historical period. Could it be that the Hongshan culture represents not a peripheral Proto-Chinese phenomenon, but an independent center of civilizational development, a tradition of social complexity, cosmological sophistication, and artistic achievement that emerged independently in northeastern China, and that may have had far-reaching influences on the later development of Chinese civilization that have not yet been fully traced? Who performed the rituals in the goddess temple? Was there a professional priesthood? And if so, how was it recruited, trained, and sustained? What exactly did the pig dragon jade form mean in Hongshan cosmology? Why was this particular hybrid form chosen as the central sacred object? Why did the Hongshan culture decline and disappear around 3000 BCE? Was it climate change, social disruption, or some internal dynamic of the ceremonial system itself? And what is the relationship, if any, between the goddess of Niuheliang and the later traditions of female divine power in Chinese religious history? Niuheliang stands as a testament to the capacity of the human religious impulse to generate complexity, art, and social organization in the absence of cities, writing, or metal. With nothing more than stone, clay, jade, and the enduring human need to reach beyond the ordinary world towards something larger and more permanent. The face of the goddess, reassembled from the clay fragments found in the temple, looks out at us from 5,500 years of distance. She has seen everything change, and yet here she is, still looking. From the ancient goddess sanctuary of Liaoning, we now travel southward, deep into the Mekong Delta of southern Vietnam, to a site that was once a major port city of the ancient maritime world, a node in the trade networks of the Indian Ocean, and a civilization so thoroughly buried by alluvial silt that its very existence was unknown until the 20th century. The Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam is one of the most fertile and intensely cultivated landscapes on Earth. A vast, flat, alluvial plain threaded with rivers and canals, brilliant green with rice paddies from horizon to horizon. The land here is young in geological terms, built up over millennia from the silt carried down from the Tibetan Plateau by the Mekong and its tributaries, and it is still being added to, centimeter by centimeter, with every flood season. Beneath the rice paddies, Buried under 2,000 years of sediment deposition, an entire civilization waits. Oc Eo is an archaeological site located in An Giang province in the Mekong Delta region of southern Vietnam, near the town of Thoai Son. Excavations, first conducted by a French archaeologist named Louis Malloret in the 1940s and subsequently expanded in recent decades, have revealed that Oc Eo was a major urban and commercial center of the ancient kingdom of Funan, the first major state in mainland Southeast Asia, which flourished between roughly the 1st and 7th centuries CE. Funan controlled a strategic position at the junction of the sea routes connecting India with China, and Oc Eo was its principal port, a city of canals, an emporium of the ancient maritime Silk Road, where merchants from Rome, Persia, India, and China all converged to exchange goods in a tropical setting that must have seemed to some of its visitors like the edge of the known world. What baffles archaeologists about Oc Eo is the remarkable range of objects that have been found at the site, objects whose geographic origins span the entire breadth of the Eurasian world. The most perplexing discovery is the presence of Roman medallions, coins, and artifacts at a site in the Mekong Delta, evidence of direct or near-direct contact between the Roman Empire and a Southeast Asian port in the 1st centuries CE. A Roman gold medallion of the Emperor Antoninus Pius, dating to the 2nd century CE, has been identified among the Oc Eo finds. How did a Roman gold medallion end up in the Mekong Delta? What kind of trading network connected Rome and Vietnam directly or through intermediaries 2,000 years ago? And what does this connectivity tell us about the true extent and density of ancient global trade? The Funan Kingdom that operated through Oc Eo was an Indianized state, a Southeast Asian polity that had absorbed Hindu and Buddhist cultural influences from India and used them to structure its political and religious life. Funan appears in Chinese annals of the 2nd century CE as a powerful state that collected tribute from a wide area and maintained maritime connections across the Gulf of Thailand and the Malacca Strait. The rulers of Funan presented themselves as Hindu kings, performing sacrifices, maintaining temples, and using Sanskrit for official inscriptions. But underneath the Indian cultural overlay, Funan was a product of the indigenous cultural traditions of the Mekong Delta, traditions of aquatic adaptation, of maritime expertise, of trade and hospitality that predated the arrival of Indian influence by many centuries. The prevailing scholarly view of Oc Eo's extraordinary cosmopolitanism emphasizes the logic of geography. The Mekong Delta sits at the midpoint of the sea routes between India and China, and any major port at this location would naturally become a node in the Trans-Asian trade network. The presence of Roman objects does not necessarily imply direct Roman trade, but is consistent with a chain of exchange, goods passing from Rome to Indian merchants, from Indian merchants to Southeast Asian traders, from Southeast Asian traders to Funan. That could produce a Roman medallion in the Mekong Delta without a single Roman ever having set foot there. Others suggest that the scale and diversity of Oc Eo's connections reflect a level of maritime knowledge and diplomatic sophistication in Funan that significantly exceeds what the standard narrative of early Southeast Asian civilization implies. The canal system that archaeologists have traced around Oc Eo, a grid of waterways that connected the port to the surrounding landscape and to other sites along the coast, suggests an urban planning and engineering capacity that rivals anything in the contemporary Indian Ocean world. Could it be that Funan was not merely a passive recipient of Indian cultural influence, but an active participant in a trans-oceanic intellectual exchange, that the sailors and merchants of Oc Eo carried not just goods, but ideas, practices, and knowledge systems back and forth across the Indian Ocean in ways that have left insufficient traces in the archaeological and textual record. Why has the site of Oc Eo been so thoroughly buried by alluvial sediment? Is this a consequence of natural delta processes, of deliberate flooding, or of the disruption of the ancient canal system that managed water flow in the region? What happened to the city when the Funan kingdom declined in the 7th century CE? Was the population absorbed by the Khmer Empire that succeeded it, or did it disperse? And what lies in the unexcavated portions of this site, which extends over an enormous area that has barely been systematically investigated? Oc Eo stands as a testament to the extraordinary reach of ancient maritime commerce, to the fact that the world of 2,000 years ago was, in its commercial and cultural connections, far more interconnected than the standard narratives of ancient civilizations suggest. The Mekong Delta has covered this city in silt, and the rice paddies have grown over it, and the farmers of Anjiang province have been plowing through Roman history for generations without knowing it. The full story of Oc Eo is still being recovered, centimeter by centimeter, from the patient earth. From the buried canals of the Mekong Delta, our final journey carries us northward across the breadth of China, to the cold grasslands of Inner Mongolia, to the site of a prehistoric settlement whose violent end left traces so perfectly preserved in the archaeological record that it reads 4,800 years later, like a crime scene that was never meant to be found. The grasslands of Inner Mongolia in late autumn are the color of old straw, pale gold, fading to brown at the edges, under a sky that is simply enormous, the kind of sky that makes the human figure feel very small and very temporary. The wind is cold and comes without obstruction from the west, from the direction of Kazakhstan and the Kazakh steppe. Streams cut through the plain in shallow valleys lined with sedge, and beneath a low mound on the south bank of a tributary of the Liao River, one of the most disturbing archaeological discoveries of modern Chinese archaeology was waiting to be found. Hamin Mangha is a Neolithic site located in Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, northeastern China, dating to approximately 3000 BCE and associated with the Lower Jiajiadian culture. The site covers roughly 17,000 square meters and was excavated in a series of campaigns beginning in 2011, revealing the remains of a settlement of wooden buildings arranged in a roughly orderly pattern across a low mound. What made this site internationally significant was not its size or its architecture, but the contents of a specific structure, a building designated F40, approximately 97 square meters in floor area, that was found to contain the commingled skeletal remains of at least 97 individuals, many of them young people, packed into the building with a density that implies they were deposited there rapidly, and that the building was then abandoned and allowed to collapse over the bodies. The site has been described carefully as evidence of mass death, but the circumstances of that mass death remain entirely unexplained. What baffles archaeologists about Hamin Mangha is the combination of the large number of dead in a single structure, the apparent speed of deposition, and the complete absence of any clear physical evidence for the cause of death. The most perplexing aspect of the discovery is that the skeletal remains show no signs of the skeletal trauma that would be expected if the deaths were caused by violence. No cut marks, no arrow tips, no evidence of blunt force. The bones show no signs of heat damage that would indicate fire as the cause. The bodies appear to have been deposited in the building while it was still structurally intact and then left there, without the elaborate burial treatment that the culture typically provided for its dead. What killed 97 people, apparently simultaneously or in rapid succession, and why were their bodies treated in such an extraordinary and anomalous way? And is there a connection between Hamin Mangha and a similar mass death event found at the roughly contemporaneous site of Miaozigu, located less than 50 kilometers away? The Lower Xiajiadian culture that inhabited the Hamin Mangha settlement was a sedentary farming community in the transition zone between the agricultural south and the pastoral steppe of the north. The material culture of the site, ceramics, stone tools, evidence of crop cultivation, and animal husbandry, is consistent with a stable, established community that had been living in this location for some time. The settlement shows evidence of organized spatial planning, with buildings arranged in a pattern that suggests communal decision-making about land use and architecture. This was not a desperate or impoverished community. It was, by all available evidence, a normally functioning prehistoric village. The prevailing scholarly hypothesis for the mass death at Hamin Mangha is epidemic disease, specifically that the community was struck by a rapidly progressing infectious illness that killed a large proportion of the population in a short time, and that the survivors, perhaps overwhelmed by the number of dead or themselves weakened and dying, deposited the bodies in a building rather than performing the normal burial rites. The discovery of a similar mass death event at Miaozigu has strengthened this hypothesis. Two sites in the same region, the same culture, and the same approximate period, both showing evidence of sudden catastrophic depopulation, suggests a regional disease event rather than a localized accident or conflict. Others suggest that the specific choice to deposit the bodies in an existing building rather than in a pit or in the open reflects a ritual logic that disease alone cannot explain. Perhaps the building was understood as a liminal space, a space between the living and the dead worlds, and the deposition of the bodies, there was an act of care and intention, not merely a disposal of inconvenient corpses. Perhaps the community was performing, under conditions of extreme stress, a ritual that its cosmological tradition prescribed for the dead who could not be buried in the normal way. Some researchers have raised the possibility that the deaths at Hamin Mangha were connected to climatic stress, that a prolonged drought or a catastrophic flood event weakened the community to the point where an otherwise survivable epidemic became fatal to almost everyone. The Inner Mongolian grassland is climatically volatile, and the late Neolithic period in northeastern China was a time of significant climatic fluctuation. What pathogen killed the people of Hamin Mangha? Is it possible to recover ancient DNA from the skeletal remains that would allow identification of the causative organism? Why were young people apparently overrepresented among the dead? Does this reflect a differential vulnerability to the disease, or does it reflect something about the social structure of the community and who was present in the settlement at the time of the disaster? What happened to the survivors, if there were any? Did they relocate? Did they join neighboring communities? Or did the disease pursue them? And is there a connection between the catastrophe at Hamin Mangha and the subsequent decline of the broader Lower Xiajiadian cultural tradition in the region? Hamin Mangha stands as a testament to the vulnerability of human communities, to the terrifying speed with which a thriving society can be reduced to silence by forces that leave no visible mark on the bones of their victims. The building that held the dead has collapsed, as buildings do. The grassland has grown over the ruins, as grassland does. The wind that moves through the dried grasses of Inner Mongolia sounds exactly as it must have sounded on the morning after. The morning after, whatever it was, that ended everything, when the survivors, if there were any, looked at the sky and tried to understand what the world had just done to them. And here, on this cold and windswept plain in the farthest northeast of China, our journey through the ancient world must pause. We have traveled from the jungle temples of Cambodia to the stepwells of Rajasthan, from the stone spheres of Costa Rica to the goddess temples of Liaoning, from the buried ports of the Mekong Delta to the mass graves of Inner Mongolia. We have asked 22 versions of the same unanswerable question. Who were these people, and what did they know, and why did it end? The answers are in the stones, in the bones, in the silt, in the clay. We have barely begun to learn how to ask the right questions. The past is patient. The past is always patient, and it will wait for us as long as we need. For every site we visited today, 100 more remain underexplored. From the temples of Bagan in Myanmar to the ruins of Taxila in Pakistan, from the mysterious stone spheres of Costa Rica to the ancient stepwell of Chand Baori in India, each place is only a fragment of a much larger, unfinished story. And for every mystery we were able to name in places like Koh Ker, Anuradhapura, or Shavin Dewantar, 100 more remain unnamed, still buried beneath rice fields, desert sands, jungle roots, and the quiet layers of everyday life in a modern world that has not yet fully understood what it is standing upon. The ancient past is not behind us. It is beneath us. It is around us. It is still speaking, not loudly, but persistently, through stone, through silence, through ruins that refuse to disappear. And the more we learn to look, the more clearly we realize how much is still waiting to be seen. If this journey has made you feel the weight of what we do not know, then that feeling is not a burden. It is an invitation. The world is older than we remember, stranger than we imagine, and far more worth exploring than any of us could ever fully exhaust. Keep asking, keep searching, keep paying attention to what others walk past without a second thought. And if you enjoy uncovering these forgotten places and ancient mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more lost cities, hidden ruins, and untold histories still waiting ahead, and I'd be glad to have you along for the next journey. Because the stones have not yet said everything they know,